She never imagined rock bottom could echo this loud. Rain hammered against the cracked windshield as Elena Cruz sat in her rusted car, her son asleep in the back seat, wrapped in a jacket that wasn't warm enough for the night. 2 weeks ago, she had an apartment, a job, a future. Now she had silence, cold, endless silence, but fate, cruel as it was, had one last twist to offer, because that same night a letter slipped under her windshield wiper, promising her a free inheritance. A ruined penthouse, no rent, no catch, or so it claimed. The city was never kind to the forgotten. It watched them break under the weight of rent receipts and overdue notices, swallowing their cries in the hum of traffic and the glow of billboards selling lives they'd never afford. Elena Cruz sat behind the steering wheel of a car that smelled of rain and gasoline, her fingers trembling against the worn leather. Outside, the storm had calmed, but inside her chest it hadn't. She stared at the envelope pressed against her thigh, the one she had found under her windshield wiper that morning. Its paper warped from drizzle. Property redemption notice. It read in faded type, followed by her name in careful, almost tender handwriting. She didn't understand why someone would send her anything now. People didn't send letters anymore, especially not to women who had nothing left. The world had taken everything. 2 weeks earlier, she was a receptionist at a mid-tier law firm, invisible behind a smile that never reached her eyes. Then came the layoffs. The manager's apology was colder than the rain that later soaked her eviction notice. By the time the building manager changed the locks, Elena and her 6-year-old son Mateo were already sitting on the curb with a single suitcase and a broken sense of direction. Now the car was their home, an island of metal adrift in the city's grey sea. She kept a small plastic bag of crackers for Mateo and a few bottled waters rolling under the seats. The sound of his breathing from the back seat was the only thing that still anchored her sanity. But tonight, something about the letter refused to leave her mind. The words were absurd. Congratulations. You have been selected for a property transfer due to the dissolution of a real estate claim. Selected? By who? For what? It mentioned an address, the Orion Tower, downtown. She remembered it faintly. A skyscraper once famous for its penthouse suites and rooftop ballroom before it went bankrupt years ago. The building had been left to rot after a structural fire and legal disputes. She had read about it once in the news. She unfolded the rest of the letter, tracing the signature at the bottom. Row Real Estate Holdings Defunct Estate. A stamp with a date long expired made it look more like a ghost document than a legal one, and yet it had her name printed cleanly, as if meant for her and no one else. She laughed quietly, a hollow, disbelieving sound that echoed in the confined car. A free inheritance, she whispered. Right, and next week I'll win the lottery. But the words dug into her mind like roots. A free inheritance. Even if it was a mistake, even if it led nowhere, what else did she have to lose? Outside, the rain thinned into mist, and the world looked briefly softer, blurred at the edges. Elena looked at her reflection in the cracked rear view mirror, tired eyes, hair clinging to her temples, a woman who had stopped recognizing herself months ago. For the first time in weeks, there was something other than despair flickering behind her gaze. Curiosity. She tucked the letter into her coat pocket, leaned back, and closed her eyes. The hum of distant traffic filled the silence like an unspoken promise. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd go see it. Whatever it was. Morning arrived gray and cold, painted in the pale blue of cheap motel lights and broken skies. Mateo stood beside her, rubbing his eyes with tiny fists. "Mommy, are we going home today?" Elena hesitated, her throat tight. "We're going to check something, maybe a new place." He smiled weakly, trusting her without question, that simple, blind trust that made her chest ache. She brushed his hair aside, trying to smile back. The drive downtown was a blur of potholes and flickering lights. The city was still half-asleep, garbage trucks rattling through alleys, old men sweeping doorsteps of shops that barely opened anymore. As she passed the river, the wind carried the sharp scent of iron and rain-soaked concrete. It was the smell of endings, and then she saw it, the Orion Tower. It rose like a phantom from the fog, its glass shattered in places, scaffolding hanging like bones from its ribs. A once majestic skyscraper, now silent and forgotten. The sun barely reached its upper floors, where darkness still clung to the broken windows like a memory that refused to fade. Elena parked at the curb, staring up in awe and unease. Matteo pressed his face to the glass. "Mom, it looks like a castle," he said softly. She swallowed. Maybe a castle that lost its king. The entrance was barricaded with rusted gates, and the marble lion statues at the front were cracked down their spines. Graffiti covered the walls, names, curses, phone numbers. Someone had painted a heart around the word doomed. For a long time, she didn't move. The logical part of her brain told her this was insane, that she was wasting fuel she couldn't afford on a fantasy. But something deeper pulled her forward, something instinctive, almost primal. She got out, the cold air biting her cheeks, and walked toward the gate. The chain around it was loose, like someone had tampered with it before. Her fingers brushed against the lock, finding it brittle with rust. A hard twist, a snap, and it came undone. The sound echoed through the empty courtyard, sharp and final. Elena froze. No alarms, no guards, no security lights. Just the whisper of wind through broken glass above her. She turned to Matteo. "Stay in the car, baby. I'll be right back." He nodded, clutching his stuffed bear. The lobby was half-submerged in shadow. Rainwater dripped from a hole in the ceiling, forming puddles that reflected the cracked chandeliers. Once, this place must have been magnificent marble floors, gold trim along the walls, a grand staircase now carpeted in dust and mold. Her footsteps echoed as she moved through the silence. Each sound felt too loud, like she was disturbing the sleep of something ancient. Her reflection stared back from a fractured mirror, fragmented into pieces. At the far end, she found a reception desk overturned, papers scattered like leaves. One folder caught her attention, its label smudged but readable. Penthouse, Unit 47A. Her heart stuttered. The same number written in the letter. She opened the folder. Inside were faded blueprints, signatures, and a black and white photograph of the penthouse in its glory days, a sprawling open floor with glass walls overlooking the city skyline. A woman stood in the photo's corner, holding a champagne glass, her smile dazzling under chandeliers. The caption read simply, "Margaret Rowe, 1993. Rowe," the same surname on the letterhead. Elena felt a chill crawl up her spine. Was this the person who once owned it? Was she the reason this letter found its way to her? A sudden crash echoed from somewhere above, metal hitting marble. Elena's head snapped up. The sound repeated, then faded into stillness. Her pulse quickened. She told herself it was just wind or a loose beam, but something about the silence after the sound didn't feel empty. She turned back toward the entrance, her footsteps quickening. When she reached the gate, she saw Matteo watching her nervously from the car. Relief washed over her, grounding her back in reality. She exhaled shakily, clutching the folder against her chest. As she drove away, the tower loomed behind her, massive, gray, unyielding. It wasn't done with her, she knew that much. That building, with its hollow windows and crumbling walls, had something inside it waiting to be found, and somewhere deep within her broken spirit, something waited too, a spark she thought was gone. The road stretched before her, slick and endless. She didn't know it yet, but the letter wasn't a mistake. It was an invitation, one that would lead her into the ruins of another life, and the heart of a secret that would change everything. As the wind whispered through the half-open window, she murmured to herself, barely above the hum of the tires, "We're going back tomorrow." The next morning came in shades of grey and silence. The city was barely awake, the streets glistening with last night's rain, as if the world had tried to wash itself clean and failed. Elena Cruz sat in the driver's seat, her hands wrapped around a cup of cheap gas station coffee that had already gone cold. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that tower again, the Orion, rising out of the fog like a monument to everything she'd lost, and everything she didn't yet understand. Matteo stirred beside her, the small blanket slipping from his shoulder. He blinked awake, eyes heavy but hopeful. "Mom, are we going back to the castle today?" She managed a tired smile. "Yeah, baby, we're going back." She didn't know why she said it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe madness. Or maybe it was the faint hum of destiny in her chest, that fragile thread of instinct that whispered this means something. The drive back downtown was quiet, except for the low static of the radio. The announcer's voice droned on about layoffs, another factory closure, another politician's promise. It was the same world that had crushed her dreams and called it economics. But somewhere between the shifting lanes and broken traffic lights, Elena realized she didn't feel hopeless anymore. She felt alive. When they reached the tower, morning fog clung to its base like ghost breath. Pigeons scattered from the ledges as she parked near the curb. The front gate still hung open, the lock broken from yesterday. She half expected to find a police notice or a guard waiting, but the world had already forgotten this place. Matteo held her hand as they stepped inside. The echo of their footsteps filled the grand lobby once again, hollow, rhythmic, haunting. The air smelled of rust and mildew, but beneath it was something else. A faint sweetness like old perfume lingering in the walls. "Stay close, okay?" she murmured. He nodded, clutching his bear tightly. They walked toward the staircase that curved upward in cracked marble steps. The higher they climbed, the dimmer the light became. Dust hung in the air like mist, each step stirring ghosts of the past into motion. By the third floor, the silence grew heavy enough to feel alive. "Mom," Matteo whispered, "why did they leave this place?" She hesitated. Maybe they had too much and forgot what really mattered. He looked up at her, his small face serious. "Then maybe we can fix it." That simple statement hit her harder than any truth she'd faced in years. She squeezed his hand and kept walking. At the landing, a broken elevator shaft yawned open like a mouth into darkness. Its cables hung loose, frayed, swaying gently with each draft. A faded sign read "Penthouse access top floor only." She glanced at the metal cage, and the ladder bolted to its side. It went up into the dark like a stairway to nowhere. Elena took a slow breath. "We'll go up, just to see." Matteo nodded. The climb was brutal. The metal rungs groaned beneath their weight, and every movement sent echoes spiraling up the hollow shaft. She went first, careful, cautious, her fingers slick with sweat despite the cold. Matteo followed close behind, brave in the way only a child can be when they still believe their parent can protect them from everything. By the time they reached the top, her arms burned. She pushed open the warped elevator door and stepped into a hallway swallowed by shadows. The air was colder here, carrying the faint scent of burnt wood. A gold plaque on the wall read simply, 47 a Penthouse suite. Her heart pounded. This was it, the one written in the letter. The door stood before her like a sentinel, tall, heavy, reinforced with chains and a rusted city warning sign that read "Condemned property, do not enter." Matteo tugged at her sleeve. What does it say? It says we're not supposed to go in, she whispered. Are we gonna listen? She looked at the lock, at the chains that looked more tired than secure, and for a long moment she hesitated. Every instinct screamed that she shouldn't cross that line, that some doors are sealed for a reason. But another voice, quieter yet stronger, rose beneath it. You've been locked out of everything your whole life. Maybe it's time to walk in. She took the crowbar from her bag, the one she'd borrowed from a maintenance shed last night. A deep breath, a steady pull, and the metal gave way with a violent clank that echoed down the corridor. Dust rained from the ceiling as the last chain snapped loose. The door creaked open an inch, then another, revealing a sliver of blackness inside. She pushed gently, and the smell hit her first time, dust and old velvet. She flicked on her flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness and revealed a world that time had forgotten. The penthouse was massive ceilings arched high above a sea of ruined luxury. Chandeliers hung crooked, their crystals dulled but still catching fragments of light. Torn curtains fluttered against shattered windows where the wind whistled in low moans. A grand piano sat in one corner, its keys yellowed, a thin layer of dust dulling its once black sheen. Empty wine bottles lay scattered across the marble floor. A broken painting leaned against the wall, the portrait of a woman in a silk gown, smiling as if she still owned the world. Elena stepped inside slowly, her flashlight trembling in her grip. Every object felt sacred, trapped in the moment its story had ended. Matteo walked beside her, his small voice barely a whisper. It's like someone left and never came back. She nodded, her throat tight. Yeah, baby, that's exactly what it looks like. They explored room by room, a bedroom with an unmade bed still draped in dusty linens, a bathroom with cracked mirrors reflecting the dull beam of her light. In the study, papers littered the desk, corners curled and faded. One letter sat sealed, wax still intact, as if waiting for someone who'd never return. Elena picked it up, running her fingers across the initials etched on the seal. M. R. The same initials from the photograph she'd seen downstairs. The room felt colder. She pocketed the letter gently and turned toward the window. The view was breathtaking even through the cracks. The city stretched out endlessly below, golden lights flickering beneath the morning fog. From this height, it almost looked peaceful, but peace was an illusion. Her flashlight caught something strange, faint scratches along the wall beside the fireplace, almost hidden under the grime. She ran her hand over them. Not random marks, straight lines, repeated, like someone had been counting days. She felt a chill crawl down her arms. Who had lived here last, and what had happened to them? Before she could think further, a low creak echoed behind her. She turned sharply, heart hammering. The piano lid had shifted slightly, as if brushed by a draft. Matteo froze beside her. "Mom, it's okay," she said quickly, though her voice trembled. "It's just the wind." She forced a smile and led him back toward the main hall. The silence pressed against her ears, thick and heavy. Somewhere deep within the building, metal groaned a sound like the tower itself remembering something it wanted to forget. She knelt beside Matteo, brushing dust from his cheek. "We're leaving for now, okay? But we'll come back when it's safe." He nodded, his small hand gripping hers tightly as they walked out through the broken door. The hallway seemed darker than before, the air heavier. By the time they reached the car, the sky had turned to molten gold. The sunrise bled across the skyline, spilling light over the tower's ruined edges. For a fleeting second, it almost looked alive again. Elena sat behind the wheel, breath unsteady, eyes fixed on the tower through the windshield. She didn't know if what she'd found was luck or warning, a gift or a trap. But deep inside, she could feel it pulsing beneath the surface of everything. This was the beginning of something vast, dangerous, and irreversible. She started the engine, her reflection ghostly in the glass. "Mom," Matteo asked softly. "Yes, baby. Are we gonna live there?" She looked up at the tower, at the glint of morning light dancing across its broken windows, and whispered, "Maybe we already do." The car rolled forward, the world slowly swallowing the building behind them. But in her chest, the echo of that place remained, its silence, its secrets, its strange pull. And though she didn't yet know why, she was certain of one thing: that tower had called her name for a reason. As dusk fell once more, Elena Cruz understood the tower wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. After that first visit, nothing in Elena's mind could quiet the echo of the Orion Tower. Days passed, yet its hollow silhouette haunted every thought, appearing in reflections, in the hum of traffic, even in the rhythm of her heartbeat. It wasn't just a building. It was a voice calling her back. For the first time in years, she felt pulled towards something instead of running from everything. The world outside still offered nothing, her phone dead, her wallet empty, her past burned to ashes. But that letter and that tower, they were a thread. And when you've lost everything, even a thread feels like a lifeline. That morning, clouds swam low over the skyline, heavy and grey. Matteo sat in the passenger seat, munching on the last pack of crackers. His small voice broke the silence. "Mom, are we going back to the castle again?" She smiled faintly, hands gripping the wheel. "We are." He grinned, crumbs on his chin. "Can I bring my bear this time?" "Of course." The car hummed weakly beneath them as she steered through cracked streets, the city thinning around them. Abandoned warehouses gave way to silent blocks where old dreams had died won. Grand hotels, empty banks, and ghosted shops with "for sale" signs bleached to bone. The air smelled of rust and rain. When they turned the last corner, the tower loomed into view again, tall, broken, majestic in its decay. Even in daylight, it looked alive in some way, like the bones of a creature that refused to die. They parked under the same skeletal tree as before. The wind carried a faint hum, the kind that wasn't quite sound, but something felt, a vibration that settled in the skin. Elena stepped out first. The sun was filtered through the clouds, soft and distant, painting the tower in shades of pewter and ghost light. The air was cold enough to make her breath visible. Matteo followed, clutching his stuffed bear in one arm and her hand in the other. The front gates still hung open, their hinges groaning like they remembered the intrusion. The marble lions glared down from their pedestals, rain-streaked and cracked, but somehow still regal guardians of a forgotten empire. Inside the lobby, the air was damp and silent except for the drip of water somewhere in the dark. Sunlight filtered through the shattered skylight, falling in pale golden columns that illuminated the dust swirling in midair. Each particle looked like it was suspended in time, waiting for something to awaken it. Elena paused at the bottom of the grand staircase, her eyes trailing over the fallen chandelier, the velvet ropes, the faded mural of angels painted across the ceiling. The faces were chipped away, eyes missing like the heavens themselves had turned blind to this place. Matteo's voice was small. "It's really big, Mom, but it feels sad." She nodded slowly, "Yeah, like it remembers." They climbed the stairs again, step by step, until they reached the corridor leading to the penthouse level. But this time, Elena didn't stop at the door. She wanted to see more, to understand the tower beyond that single room. Each floor told its own story. The second level had once been luxury apartments. Now, each door hung half open, revealing hollow rooms where mold crept up the wallpaper like veins. A child's toy sat in the corner of one, its faded eyes staring blankly through the dust. In another, a dinner table was still set for a meal that never came. Plates, glasses, silver were all frozen in time, covered in decades of silence. Matteo peeked inside. Did people live here too? Yes, she whispered. A long time ago. Why did they leave? She didn't answer right away. Her eyes lingered on a framed photo left on a cracked counter, a family smiling in front of a Christmas tree. The faces had faded, but the joy still glowed faintly through the haze. She set it down gently, her fingers trembling. Maybe, she said finally, the building stopped being a home. A gust of wind sighed through the broken windows, carrying faint echoes that almost sounded like whispers. Matteo stepped closer to her. She squeezed his hand. They moved on. The third floor was darker. The smell of mildew thickened. Her flashlight beam danced across walls peeling like old paint skin. She caught glimpses of designer wallpaper, the remnants of luxury carpeting, and an abandoned elevator cart wedged between floors. The sound of their footsteps echoed deep into the silence, so deep that it didn't come back right away. She stopped listening. There it was, a faint creak above them, then silence again. Elena swallowed, probably just whined. She murmured, but the sound came again, slow, measured. Matteo's grip on her tightened. "Mom," she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We'll go upstairs, okay? We're almost at the top." The upper floors felt different, cleaner, somehow, as if the decay hadn't reached this high. The walls, though dusty, still bore fragments of paintings, gilt, framed and water-stained but elegant. The hallways stretched long and quiet, lit by slits of sunlight piercing through broken blinds, and then the door. Penthouse 47A. The sign still gleamed faintly, brass dulled but not erased. The chains now lay coiled on the floor, broken from the day before. Elena's stomach tightened. She pushed the door open and stepped inside once more. The air hit her immediately, colder than before, still heavy with the scent of something old and forgotten. The wind whispered through the shattered windows, carrying faint echoes of the city below. She walked slowly through the vast living space, her eyes tracing every detail she hadn't noticed last time. The furniture was still, their couches draped in sheets, a grand dining table set for guests who never returned, and the massive piano gleaming faintly beneath the dust. Sunlight reached across the floor, illuminating scattered pages near the fireplace. She crouched to look closer. They were old property receipts, checks, and letters, each stamped with the name Rowe Holdings. Her mind flashed to the letter that brought her here. The same name. Somewhere deep in the walls, the building groaned again, the slow, weary sound of something ancient shifting in its sleep. Matteo wandered toward a corner, his small voice echoing softly. "Mom, there's a picture here." She followed, and there it was, a large photograph, cracked down the middle, showing the tower in its prime. The lobby gleamed, chandeliers blazing with gold light. People in gowns and tuxedos smiled for the camera. In the center of them all stood a woman with dark hair, eyes sharp and full of command. Margaret Rowe, the same face from the photo downstairs, the same initials sealed on that letter in the study. Elena felt her throat tighten. "That's her," she whispered. "The woman who owned all this. She looks like she's watching us." Matteo said quietly. Elena looked closer. The crack in the glass split the woman's eyes perfectly in half, one side kind, the other dark. Thunder rumbled outside, low and distant. The storm was returning. Elena turned toward the windows. Beyond them, the city stretched endlessly below, its skyline fading under gray clouds. She wondered how it must have looked from here decades ago, glittering, full of promise, before greed and ruin hollowed it out. She moved through the penthouse slowly, her flashlight sweeping across forgotten relics, a jeweled comb, a half-empty perfume bottle, a shoe turned to leather dust. Every item was a fragment of a life once lived in luxury, now decayed to silence, and yet Despite the ruin, there was beauty, a strange, tragic beauty that made her chest ache. She stopped at the piano. Her fingers brushed across its keys. The sound that came out was brittle, a ghost of a note, but it echoed through the room, haunting and perfect in its fragility. Matteo smiled faintly. "Play something." "I can't," she said softly. "It's broken." "Then maybe it just needs someone to try." His words lingered in the air, as tender as the dust motes floating in the sunlight. She pressed another key, another faint tone, and for a moment the room didn't feel empty. Then a noise. It came from deeper within the penthouse near the study. A low metallic thud. Then another. Elena froze, heart hammering. The sound wasn't random. It was deliberate. She turned toward the hall, flashlight trembling in her hand. The air grew heavier. The faint perfume scent thickened, sharp and floral, like something freshly opened after years of sleep. "Mom," Matteo whispered, clutching her arm, "someone's here." Elena took a step forward, breath shallow, every instinct screaming at her to leave. But curiosity burned hotter than fear. At the end of the corridor, the study door stood ajar. She pushed it open slowly, light sweeping across the walls. Nothing. Just the same dusty desk, the same empty shelves, and the faint echo of her own heartbeat in her ears. Then, from behind the bookshelf, she heard it, the hollow echo. A sound not of footsteps, but of space. Empty space behind solid wall. She took a slow step closer, pressing her palm against the panel. It gave slightly under pressure. Matteo's voice trembled. "What is it?" Elena's eyes narrowed. "I don't know, but I think this wall is lying." And as the last echoes faded into silence, the tower seemed to breathe as if it had been waiting for her to find it all along. The discovery of that hollow sound changed everything. It wasn't just the echo of an empty room, it was the kind of sound that made the air shift, like something behind it was holding its breath. Elena stood still for several seconds, flashlight trembling, ears straining for another clue. The tower had gone completely quiet again, and the silence was heavier now, charged with something she couldn't name. She pressed her hand against the wall once more. This time she felt a faint vibration, not mechanical, not alive, but as if the building itself remembered the movement of her touch. Matteo whispered behind her, "Is there a room there?" Elena turned, her voice low. "Maybe, or a space someone wanted to hide." The words came out before she could think. They sounded foreign in her mouth, too calm for the storm rolling in her chest. She looked back at the seam in the wall. The wallpaper here was different, faintly patterned, slightly newer than the rest. Someone had covered this spot carefully, deliberately. Her fingers traced along the edges until they found a small gap, a fine, invisible line of separation. She felt the outline of something square, a hidden panel. She stood there for a long moment, trying to breathe, trying to tell herself that whatever was behind it was none of her business. But deep down, she knew she'd already crossed that line. "Mom," Matteo whispered again, fear and wonder tangled in his small voice. "What if it's a secret room?" Elena looked at him. His eyes were wide, reflecting the flashlight's beam. Despite the fear, there was that same spark, the one that still believed in mysteries, in good endings. And somehow that gave her courage. "Stay close," she said softly. She gripped the edge of the old wallpaper and tugged. The fabric tore with a dry hiss, releasing a small cloud of dust that smelled of rust and old paper. Beneath it, a narrow wooden seam revealed itself, a door, maybe 2 feet wide, hidden flush against the wall. There was no handle, only a small iron keyhole filled with grime. Elena's pulse quickened. "They locked it from the outside," she murmured. "Whatever's in there. Someone wanted it sealed." She reached into her bag and pulled out the small screwdriver. She always carried, one of the few things left from her old job. where she used to fix broken office drawers and jammed locks when no one else would. Her hands shook as she knelt, prying at the edges. The first screw gave easily. The second took more effort. The metal creaked and protested, like it didn't want to let go. Finally, the panel shifted. A soft click. The door opened an inch, releasing a breath of air so cold it felt alive. Elena froze. The smell was faint but unmistakable, a blend of damp wood, paper, and something metallic beneath. She raised the flashlight. The beam revealed a narrow cavity behind the wall, barely large enough to stand in. Inside, cobwebs glistened like silk threads in the light. Dust hung thick, undisturbed for decades. And at the center, built into the brick itself, was a small iron box, a safe. Her heart lurched. It was old, rust-eaten, the kind that belonged to another century. But even through the decay, its purpose was clear. Someone had hidden it, sealed it away, and never returned. Matteo's voice was barely a breath. "Is that treasure?" Elena didn't answer. She couldn't. The air around her seemed to hum with electricity. She reached out, fingertips brushing the metal. It was cold enough to sting. The safe was locked, of course, the circular dial jammed, numbers faded with age. Her reflection stared back faintly from its rusted surface. A woman she barely recognized, tired, thin, yet filled with a strange light that hadn't been there before. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. The wind outside the tower howled, whistling through cracks in the glass like distant voices calling through tunnels. She stepped back, forcing herself to breathe. "We're not touching it today," she said quietly. "We don't know what's inside." Matteo looked disappointed. "But what if it's something good?" She smiled sadly. "Or something that should stay buried." The boy tilted his head, as if trying to understand. "Then why does it feel like it's waiting for you?" Elena's breath caught. He said it so innocently, but the words landed with the weight of truth. She turned off the flashlight just for a second. The darkness swallowed them both. The wind moaned through the tower, and the floor creaked as if shifting beneath their feet. Somewhere distant, a pipe dripped water in slow rhythm, tick, 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 like the tower's heartbeat, faint but constant. She turned the light back on and sealed the panel again, pressing it gently closed. The wall swallowed the secret once more. For now, they descended slowly, the echo of their steps fading into the silence below. On the second floor, Elena paused. The sun was setting, casting long golden spears through the shattered windows. For a fleeting moment, the tower glowed alive again, wrapped in light that didn't belong to it anymore. Matteo stopped beside her. "It's pretty," he whispered. She nodded. "Yeah, it's pretending." When they stepped outside, the wind hit them hard, colder now, sharper, carrying the smell of rain. The sky was bruising with storm clouds again, the kind that rolled in from nowhere, fast and heavy. Elena buckled Matteo into the car and stood by the open door for a long moment, staring back at the tower. The windows were black now, each pane a blank eye staring down at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching, that it knew, and somewhere high above in that penthouse she'd just left, the faintest flicker of light pulsed behind the cracked glass. It could have been lightning or reflection, but deep down she knew better. Someone or something was still there. She got into the car, turned the key, and the engine groaned to life. The wipers scraped across the windshield, pushing away the first drops of rain. As they drove off, she glanced one last time in the rear-view mirror. The tower loomed half, shrouded in fog, a ghost among the living skyline. "Mom," Matteo murmured sleepily, "when can we go back?" She looked at him, then at the road ahead, endless, empty, slick with rain. "Soon," she said softly, "but next time we bring tools." The words slipped out before she could stop them, the kind of words that make promises to fate. As thunder rolled across the horizon, the Orion Tower disappeared behind the curtain of rain. But its image stayed, burned into her mind, the hidden safe, the initials M.R., and the unshakable sense that she was walking straight into someone else's unfinished story. She didn't know it yet, but what she'd uncovered wasn't just a secret. It was an inheritance of ghosts, and every ghost, sooner or later, comes to collect what's owed. That night, as lightning danced beyond the city skyline, Elena Cruz dreamed of walls whispering her name and a locked box that pulsed like a heartbeat in the dark. The rain had returned by morning, steady, cold, and merciless. It struck the windshield in sharp, impatient taps as Elena parked once again beneath the towering shadow of the Orion. This time, there was no hesitation. The letter, the chains, the hidden compartment, all of it had carved too deep a mark on her mind. The world outside her car felt faded, unreal, but the tower was alive. She turned to Matteo, fastening his small coat. "You'll stay close today, okay?" He nodded, solemn, as if he understood that whatever they were walking into wasn't just another building. It was something between a memory and a warning. They entered through the open gates, their footsteps echoing softly across the flooded marble floor. The air smelled of stone and wet iron. Light filtered down from the cracked skylight like water through glass-thin, trembling beams that illuminated motes of dust swirling in slow motion. Every sound mattered here. The scrape of her shoe, the drip from a broken pipe, the distant creak of wind moving through hollow halls. Elena led Matteo to the staircase. Her flashlight flickered against the golden veins of marble. The shimmer of old wealth turned ghostly. By the time they reached the penthouse, the storm outside had thickened into thunder, deep, rolling, restless. The door to 47A stood open from the last time she forced it. Beyond it, the same frozen world awaited, couches covered in sheets, a chandelier that still clung to the ceiling by threads of metal, and that grand piano waiting silently by the window. But today, she wasn't here to marvel. She was here to understand. She walked straight to the study, the room with the hollow wall. The panel was still sealed, her earlier pry marks visible along the edges. For a moment, she hesitated, her breath catching. What if she found something dangerous? What if whoever built this hiding place was still around, watching? Her hand tightened around the screwdriver. The wind rattled the cracked window behind her, and somewhere in the building's belly, a metallic groan rolled upward like a sigh. Matteo hovered near the doorway, his voice soft. "Mom, is it still there?" "Yes," she whispered, touching the wall. "It's waiting." The screwdriver's tip wedged under the seam. A quick twist, then another, until the wooden edge gave way again with a dry pop. Dust spilled out, faint and grey. The panel slid open. There it was, the small iron safe, buried in shadow, coated in a thin skin of rust. Elena crouched before it, her flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. She could hear her pulse in her ears, each beat echoing louder than the thunder outside. It wasn't a big safe, no more than a foot high, but it radiated a weight that was almost unnatural. It didn't belong to time anymore. It belonged to secrets. Her fingers traced the faded numbers on the dial, 2, 6, 9. The rest were almost unreadable. She tried turning it gently. The dial moved, grinding softly, locked tight. She sat back on her heels. "Old combination lock," she murmured. "Could be rusted shut." Matteo leaned closer, eyes wide. "Can you open it?" "Maybe not today." But the truth was, she wanted to open it today. She wanted to know what was inside, even if it scared her. The weight of the unknown pressed harder than fear. She ran her hand along the top, feeling for anything unusual. Her palm brushed over something faint etching in the metal. She brought the flashlight closer. There, carved by hand, were 3 initials, M.R. Margaret Rowe, the name she had seen in the photograph downstairs, the woman in the black and white picture, the owner of this tower, of this life, of everything. The air felt thinner suddenly. Elena exhaled, staring at the engraving. She hid this herself, she said quietly. The wind howled, almost as if the building agreed. She imagined Margaret Rowe in this very room decades ago, wealthy, powerful, untouchable, sealing something behind that wall. What could a woman like that need to hide? Elena's mind filled with possibilities: money, jewelry, scandal, evidence, or something worse. Her hands trembled as she closed the panel again. "We'll come back," she whispered, mostly to herself. But before she could stand, something caught her attention, a corner of faded paper, sticking out from beneath the desk. She reached for it, pulling free a torn photograph. It showed the same woman, Margaret, standing beside a man in a tailored suit. Their smiles were polished, practiced, but behind them the background made Elena's heart twist. Was this very room, untouched and new, the walls still white, the chandelier glowing? At the bottom of the photo, written in elegant cursive, was a date, May 19, 1993. She flipped it over. 2 words scrawled on the back in hurried pen: "If they find this, burn everything." Her hand froze. A sound, sharp, faint, echoed behind her. A click, like a door latch shifting somewhere in the penthouse. She turned quickly, flashlight sweeping across the room. The air was still. Matteo stood frozen near the doorway, eyes wide. "Mom," he whispered, "someone's here." Her blood ran cold. She moved fast, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the corridor. They hurried down the hallway, the sound of their footsteps swallowed by thunder outside. When they reached the staircase, she turned back once. Nothing, just the open door swinging slightly from the draft. But she could feel it, that strange, unseen presence pressing against her chest. They descended in silence, the old building creaking around them like it was trying to speak. By the time they reached the lobby, rain was pouring hard enough to blur the world beyond the glass doors. Elena shoved them open and stepped into the downpour, gasping at the sudden rush of cold air. Her pulse was still racing. She didn't stop until they were in the car, doors locked, headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. Matteo sat beside her, clutching his bear tight. "Mom, who was that?" Elena swallowed hard. "No one," she said, but she didn't believe it. Her reflection stared back from the rear-view mirror, pale, trembling, eyes haunted by something she couldn't explain. Behind her, the tower rose like a monolith against the storm, its windows glowing faintly with lightning flashes. And in one of those flashes, for the briefest heartbeat, she thought she saw movement. A shadow in the penthouse window, standing still, watching. She blinked. It was gone, but she knew she hadn't imagined it. Whatever was inside that tower, behind those walls, wasn't finished with her yet. She pressed a shaking hand over her chest, feeling her heartbeat thunder beneath her palm. She whispered to herself, "Tomorrow, I'm opening it." The storm roared in answer, like the tower itself was listening. As the rain swallowed the city, the Orion Tower stood awake in the dark, a sleeping empire waiting to reveal what it had buried alive. That night, the storm refused to end. Rain lashed against the windows of the cheap roadside motel where Elena and Matteo had taken shelter. The neon sign outside buzzed and flickered, bleeding red light across the damp curtains. Each gust of wind made the walls tremble, as though the storm itself wanted to whisper through the cracks. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, her mind still inside the Orion Tower. The safe, the initials, the photograph, those words scrawled on the back: "If they find this, burn everything." They looped in her head like a broken record. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadow in the penthouse window. It hadn't moved like wind. It hadn't flickered like light. It had watched. She rose quietly, careful not to wake Matteo, and stepped into the tiny kitchenette. The hum of the old fridge filled the silence. She unfolded the photograph again beneath the harsh yellow bulb. The ink had bled slightly from the years, but the message was still clear, urgent, desperate: burn everything. She traced the initials M.R. with her thumb. Margaret Rowe. A name that carried too much weight for a woman who'd lost everything to carry alone. The letter, the inheritance notice, the sealed safe, none of it made sense. But deep inside, Elena felt something she couldn't shake. This was never a mistake. Somehow her name had been meant to reach that envelope. A car passed outside, its headlights slicing through the rain. For a split second, she saw movement reflected in the mirror, a silhouette wet by the window, gone in a blink. Her heart stopped. She rushed over, yanking the curtains open. Nothing, just the empty parking lot and the dripping neon glow. Still, her pulse wouldn't settle. She double-checked the door lock, slid the chain across, then turned back toward the bed. Matteo slept soundly, his small hand curled around his bear. The sight anchored her, reminded her why she couldn't just walk away. Whatever secrets that tower held, whatever danger it carried, she had to face it. Because fate had already chosen her, and fate didn't make mistakes, only promises dressed as warnings. She whispered to herself, "Tomorrow I finish this." The next morning broke pale and heavy with mist. The rain had quieted, leaving the world washed clean but colorless. Elena filled the gas tank with her last $20, the pump clicking empty like a clock striking destiny. Matteo munched on a cereal bar in the passenger seat, sleepy but calm. "Are we going back again?" Elena met his eyes in the mirror. "Just for a little while. I have to check something." He nodded. The secret wall, a smile ghosted across her lips. "Yeah, the secret wall." The drive back to the Orion felt shorter this time. Familiar. The city seemed smaller somehow, as if it was already receding from her life, leaving only that tower, colossal, haunting, inevitable. When they arrived, the morning fog was thick enough to blur the top floors. The building loomed half, hidden in the gray, like a mountain swallowed by its own storm. The gates stood open as always, inviting and ominous at once. Inside, silence greeted them like an old friend. Elena led Matteo to the penthouse again, climbing each step slowly, feeling the air grow colder with every floor. The sound of their breathing filled the stairwell, mingling with the distant hum of wind. By the time they reached 47A, her hands were slick with sweat despite the chill. The door creaked when she pushed it open, its sound echoing deep into the hollow space. The penthouse looked untouched, the same broken piano, the same torn curtains, the same faint perfume of time and dust. But something felt different. The silence was thicker, the air heavier. She walked straight to the study. The wall waited for her like a held breath. Elena knelt and peeled the panel back again, revealing the iron safe. The flashlight's beam trembled in her grip. She'd brought tools this time, a crowbar, a wrench, and the smallest hammer she could find in the motel's maintenance closet. She set them down carefully, heart thudding. "Mom, what if it's locked forever?" Matteo asked softly. "Then we find a way," she said, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince, him or herself. She turned the dial again. It barely budged, stiff with rust. A few tries, a sharp click, and nothing. She exhaled hard, frustration rising, the sound of thunder in her chest. She looked around for something else, anything that might help, and then she saw it. On the corner of the desk sat a small brass key, tarnished half, buried under papers. She hadn't noticed it before. It felt almost placed there, waiting. Her hand shook as she picked it up. It was old, ornate, engraved with the same initials, M.R. Her breath caught. She brought the key to the safe, the metal trembling in her grip. The lock resisted at first, a stubborn relic of the past, but with a twist and a soft snap, it gave. The door creaked open an inch, and the air that escaped was colder than before, stale and heavy with the scent of iron and old secrets. Inside were papers, stacks of them, yellowed and curled. Beneath them, something glinted faintly in the flashlight's beam, metal edges, embossed seals. She reached in slowly, lifting the contents one by one. Old jewelry, a silver locket, a small velvet pouch tied with gold thread, and beneath it all a stack of crisp, aging paper certificates, bonds. Dozens of them, each stamped with an official seal and numbers she couldn't comprehend. Her eyes scanned the words, bearer bonds payable to holder, value $500,000. Her pulse stopped. She counted 5, 10, 20, 50. Each one worth a fortune. The total hit her like lightning. $75 million. Her breath came short, dizzying. The room swayed. She sat back hard on the floor, the papers slipping through her trembling fingers. "Mom," Matteo's small voice broke through the fog. "Is it money?" She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "It's more than money." He frowned. "Then why do you look scared?" Elena looked at him, tears welling in her eyes, not of joy, but of something deeper. Fear, guilt, awe, because in that moment she knew this wasn't luck. This was legacy. Someone had hidden this fortune not just from the world, but from justice, and now, by fate's cruel hand, it belonged to her. She stared at the safe, the initials carved into its metal, and the weight of the past pressed down on her like a hand on her shoulder. Margaret Rowe hadn't meant to leave behind a gift. She'd left behind a ghost. And now Elena carried both. She packed the bonds back into the safe, heart racing, hands trembling. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The air felt electric, as though the tower itself had come alive around her. Thunder rumbled in the distance, closer this time. A flash of lightning illuminated the window, and for an instant, Elena thought she saw movement again, a shadow slipping down the hallway beyond the door. Her breath caught. "Matteo, stay here. Mom, stay here," she whispered sharply, grabbing the flashlight. She stepped into the hallway, its length stretching before her like a tunnel through the storm. Nothing moved, no sound, just the slow drip of water from the ceiling and the whisper of wind crawling through cracks. She turned back toward the study and froze. The door was half closed. She hadn't touched it. Her pulse spiked, heat flooding her veins. She stepped closer, each movement slow, cautious. Pushed the door open again. Matteo was standing by the desk, looking at something in his hand. The photograph. He looked up. "Mom, the lady in the picture. She's smiling." Elena frowned, confused. "What do you mean? She wasn't smiling before." She took the photo from him, holding it under the flashlight. Her breath hitched. He was right. The crack in the glass had shifted, somehow splitting differently now, and in that subtle distortion, the woman's mouth curved upward in what looked like a smile. It was impossible, and yet, under the trembling light, it looked real. The thunder outside cracked like an explosion, rattling the chandelier overhead. The whole building groaned. Elena grabbed Matteo's hand. "We're leaving now." They ran through the penthouse, down the stairs, their footsteps echoing off marble and metal. The tower seemed to hum behind them, as if alive with unseen motion. By the time they burst through the front doors, the rain had turned to sheets. She didn't stop running until they reached the car. When she finally turned the key, the headlights flared, and in the beam of light reflecting off the tower's glass, she saw the faint outline of a face in one of the top windows. Watching, still smiling. That night, long after she drove away, lightning split the sky over the Orion Tower, and for the briefest instant, the penthouse windows flickered with light, as if the past itself had just awakened. After the storm subsided, the world felt eerily calm. The streets shimmered under the thin morning sun, but inside Elena Cruz's chest, a different kind of weather brewed, a storm made of curiosity, guilt, and a quiet, dangerous hope. The discovery of the safe had changed everything. She couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the iron box again, the faded initials, the stacks of ancient bonds, the glint of buried fortune. $75 million. The number didn't sound real. It felt cursed, whispered by the ghosts of whoever left it behind. And yet, even knowing that, she couldn't let it go. By sunrise, Elena had made her decision. She would return, not just to look but to understand. Matteo ate his breakfast in the passenger seat, eyes still half closed from sleep. "Mom, are we moving in there?" he asked between bites. Elena managed a small smile. "Not yet, baby. We just need to make sure it's safe first." He grinned at his own pun, but she didn't. The word safe had taken on a new meaning now. When they reached the Orion, the building was bathed in pale light, its cracked glass catching the sun like shattered mirrors. The fog had lifted, but the silence remained. No sirens, no footsteps, not even birds. The air was too still, as if the tower existed outside time. They entered through the gate again. The marble lions stood guard, chipped and blind, rainwater drying on their backs. Inside, the lobby smelled of wet stone and rust. The puddles from yesterday's storm reflected the fractured ceiling above, like portals into another world. Elena's footsteps echoed as she crossed the room. The sound was sharp, rhythmic, too loud for an empty space. She froze once, certain she heard another echo following, slightly delayed, lighter, like someone else's steps answering hers. But when she turned around, there was only silence. She climbed the staircase slowly, each step groaning under her weight. Matteo followed close behind, his small hand clutching the railing, his bear dangling from the other. At the top, the hallway stretched before them like a tunnel of dust and faded gold. Sunlight leaked through cracks in the curtains, spilling over broken picture frames and half-open doors. When they reached the penthouse, the air felt colder than before. The scent of mildew and perfume still lingered. The chandelier swayed slightly, though there was no wind. Elena moved directly toward the study, the place where everything began. The panel in the wall stood open just as she had left it, the safe hidden behind like a dark eye staring out. For a long moment she simply looked at it. That box was more than metal and rust now. It was a crossroads, a choice she hadn't made yet, but couldn't avoid forever. Matteo's voice broke the silence. "Mom, what's inside again?" Elena turned to him, her throat tight. "Papers, old ones. They belonged to someone who used to live here." He nodded slowly, as if the answer made sense. "Maybe they want you to have them." Her heart sank. Children said things like that, pure, innocent things, but this didn't feel innocent. It felt like a transaction between the living and the dead. She stepped closer, kneeling by the safe. Her fingertips brushed its surface, cold as stone, damp from years of neglect. Inside, the bonds waited, sealed in the quiet of their forgotten value. Elena stared at them, then at the initials carved into the door. M.R. Margaret Rowe. The name that now lived in her head like a ghost whispering through walls. Why her? Why now? She looked around the study again. The bookshelves, the desk, the peeling wallpaper. Her gaze fell on a painting above the fireplace, a tall portrait of a woman in a silk gown. Eyes proud, smile distant. The same woman from the photograph. She walked closer, flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. The painting was coated in dust, the colors muted but still alive beneath the grime. She brushed a corner clean and felt the faint texture of canvas beneath her fingertips. Her breath hitched behind the frame, a soft echo. Hollow, her heart skipped. She tapped again gently. The sound was unmistakable wood over empty space. "Matteo," she whispered, "hand me the screwdriver." He handed it over without question. She slid the tool behind the frame, prying slowly. The nails resisted, squealing softly before giving way. The frame came loose with a dull thud, releasing a cloud of dust that shimmered in the flashlight's beam. Behind it, another panel, smaller, square, slightly ajar. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it open. Inside was a small recess, barely large enough for a shoebox. Inside it lay a bundle wrapped in cloth, tied with frayed ribbon. Elena reached in carefully, her pulse thrumming in her ears. The bundle was light but firm, its fabric rough with age. She set it on the desk and began untying the ribbon. The cloth fell away. Inside was a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and faded, initials pressed into the corner M.R. again. Her throat tightened as she opened it. The first page was dated April 3, 1993. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, the kind of cursive you don't see anymore. She began to read. They think I don't know what they've done, but I see everything. The books don't lie and neither do the walls. I've moved the documents upstairs, where even the fire won't find them. If anyone comes looking, may they understand this wasn't greed. It was survival. Elena's hands shook as she turned the next page. The ink was smeared, but the words were still legible. He said he'd come back for it, but I don't believe him anymore. The others have vanished. The calls have stopped. I hear footsteps in the halls at night. I think they're watching me. If I disappear, let it be known I tried to make it right. A chill ran through her spine. She looked up, half expecting to see someone standing behind her. But there was only Matteo, watching quietly, eyes wide. What does it say, Mom? She closed the journal gently. It's someone's story, a long one. He frowned. Is it a sad story? Elena hesitated, then whispered, maybe not finished. The storm outside cracked like a whip, lightning flashing across the window. For a second, the entire room lit up, and in that brief flash, Elena thought she saw something reflected in the glass behind her. A woman's face, pale, watching. She spun around. Nothing. Only the painting's empty frame swaying gently on the wall. Her heart pounded. The journal felt heavier in her hands now, as though it carried more than words, as though it carried memory itself. She placed it carefully in her bag, then turned toward the door. Come on, Matteo, we're leaving for now. He obeyed, though his eyes kept drifting back toward the study. Mom, he said softly, I think she's still here. Elena didn't answer. She didn't need to, because deep down she felt it too, that invisible pull, that lingering presence in the air. The tower was alive with more than just echoes, and as she closed the penthouse door behind her, she knew she had only opened the first page of a story written long before she arrived. As the last echo of their footsteps faded down the stairwell, the portrait's frame swung once, and the faint sound of a woman's sigh filled the empty room. Night came again like a slow tide, crawling over the city in shades of black and amber. The rain had stopped, but the air still clung thick with the smell of wet concrete and secrets. Elena Cruz sat in her car, the journal open across her lap, the motel's parking lot light flickering through the windshield. She had spent hours reading through the fragile pages, piecing together fragments of a woman's fear written 3 decades earlier. Margaret Rowe wasn't just another name on a deed. She was the last voice that spoke from inside the Orion before it turned into a tomb. Every line breathed tension. The numbers are wrong, the bank knows, the bonds aren't covered. They will come for them and for me, but I won't let them take what was built from nothing. I hear them outside the door. He said fire solves everything, but he doesn't know the tower will remember. Elena shivered. The words read like prophecy. She turned another page, the last one. The ink was faint, the writing jagged and rushed, as if written by shaking hands. If you find this, you're part of it now. The bonds are cursed by greed. They were my redemption and my ruin. Do not trust anyone who comes asking for me, especially not him. The line stopped there. No signature, no ending, just silence. Elena leaned back, the paper trembling in her grip. Especially not him. The words gnawed at her. Who was him? The man in the photograph, the one standing beside Margaret with that thin, careful smile. The air in the car felt heavy. Every noise, every passing vehicle, every rustle of wind made her nerves tighten. The shadows outside seemed deeper than before, the kind that weren't shaped by light but by intent. She closed the journal slowly, whispering to herself, "What were you hiding, Margaret?" By morning, her decision was made. The bonds were still in the safe, untouched. But the more she read, the clearer it became those papers weren't just money. They were evidence, maybe even blood money. She had to know where they came from. When they arrived at the tower again, the air was brighter, but the building looked no less haunted. The marble steps glistened under the weak sun, each one a mirror to the sky's dull light. Matteo skipped a few steps ahead, clutching his bear, humming softly. "Mom," he said, glancing back, "what if the lady in the picture was good?" Elena smiled faintly. "Maybe she was, maybe she made mistakes. But she left you a gift," he said innocently. Elena's gaze drifted upward to the top floor, or a burden. Inside, the building welcomed them with the same breathless quiet. The sound of their shoes echoed through the vast emptiness, filling spaces that hadn't heard voices in decades. Dust shimmered in sunbeams cutting through the fractured glass, floating like snow caught in slow motion. They climbed the stairs again, the rhythm of their steps almost musical in the stillness. When they reached the penthouse, Elena paused before the door, not out of fear this time, but respect. It felt like crossing into someone's memory, and memories demanded reverence. The study awaited as they had left it, the hollow wall, the open panel, the scent of old paper and fading perfume. Elena set her bag on the desk, pulled out the journal, and began taking notes in her own handwriting. She wanted to map the timeline, the clues, the connections between Margaret's words and what she'd found. But halfway through a sentence she froze, there a faint sound, a slow, deliberate creak. It came from the hallway just outside. Her pulse quickened. "Matteo," she whispered. He looked up from the corner where he was tracing dust shapes on the floor. I didn't move. Elena held her breath, listening. Another creak, closer this time, the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps, soft, measured, cautious. Her mind raced. The tower was supposed to be empty. No one came here, not anymore. She stood, grabbing the flashlight, heart pounding against her ribs. "Stay here." She mouthed to Matteo. She stepped into the hallway. The air was colder than before, as if the building was holding its breath with her. The light from the study spilled into the corridor in a thin, trembling stripe. At the far end, something shifted, the faint silhouette of movement. A shadow retreating behind the corner. "Hello," she called out, voice cracking slightly. No answer, only the wind whispering faintly through the cracks. She took one step forward, two. The old boards creaked underfoot. Then silence. A small object rolled out from the corner and stopped at her feet. A coin, old, tarnished, spinning slowly before settling flat on the floor. Her stomach dropped. Someone had thrown it. She grabbed Matteo's hand and backed into the study, slamming the door shut. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Mom, what was that?" Matteo's voice trembled. "Nothing." She lied. "It's okay, we're okay." But they weren't. The tower wasn't just haunted by the past. Someone else was here, someone alive. She locked the study door, her gaze darting to the safe. The open panel seemed darker now, deeper. The air carried the faint scent of smoke. Elena turned off her flashlight and listened. Through the thick silence, she heard it, a low hum, almost mechanical, echoing faintly through the vents. A generator, a machine? No, it was too faint, too inconsistent. Then came the sound again, a metallic scrape, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor one level below. Her skin prickled. Whoever was there knew she'd been coming. They were waiting. She reached for Matteo's hand. "We're leaving." Quietly. They slipped out through the stairwell, footsteps soft as breath. Every sound, every creak, every gust felt magnified, like the building itself was listening. When they reached the lobby, Elena's eyes flicked toward the broken reception desk. A faint beam of light cut across it, not sunlight, but a flashlight. Someone was there. She gripped Matteo tighter and whispered, "Run." They bolted through the open gate, rain beginning to fall again in soft, relentless sheets. Behind them, the tower loomed still, watchful, eternal. By the time they reached the car, Elena's hands were trembling. She fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine. The headlights illuminated the wet pavement, slicing through the mist. In the rear-view mirror, for one fleeting moment, she saw a figure standing at the gates, holding something metallic in hand. A flashlight, watching her leave. Back at the motel, Elena locked the door and collapsed onto the bed, still shaking. Matteo was quiet, sensing her fear but not asking. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. She opened the journal again, turning to the last page. The ink shimmered faintly in the lamplight. One line she hadn't noticed before, hidden beneath a fold in the paper, stared back at her. "If you read this, it means he found me, and now he'll find you." Her heart froze. The lamp flickered once, then again. Somewhere outside, a car engine started slow, steady, idling in the distance. Elena's breath caught. Someone knew. Someone had followed her. And in that instant, the fortune in the wall stopped being a miracle. It became a countdown. As the night deepened and thunder rolled once more beyond the horizon, Elena Cruz understood that the safe had not been waiting to be opened, it had been waiting to be found. The night she found the truth, Elena Cruz didn't sleep at all. Rain drummed softly against the motel window, a steady rhythm that refused to lull her into rest. The glow from the parking lot sign seeped through the blinds, flickering in pulses like a heartbeat. In her hands lay the leather journal, the edges curled and darkened by time. The words within now burned into her memory. "He will find you." That single line repeated in her mind until the sound of it almost blended with the rain. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to leave the city, to take Matteo, to vanish. But each time she imagined driving away, the same thought cut through her fear like a blade. If she leaves, the secret wins again. Margaret Rose's story wasn't finished. And somehow, through some cruel twist of fate, Elena was part of its ending. When dawn finally arrived, she stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her face looked older, sharper. Shadows hollowed her eyes, but there was something new there too, defiance. She turned to the bed, where Matteo still slept, his small hand gripping the edge of his blanket. His chest rose and fell softly, his innocence unbothered by the chaos that haunted his mother. Elena brushed his hair aside, whispering, "I'll fix this, baby. I promise." By mid-morning the sky had cleared. A thin, hesitant light bathed the cracked streets as she parked once again outside the Orion Tower. The silence that always lingered here was waiting, heavy, suffocating, patient. She stepped out of the car, clutching the small toolkit she'd borrowed from the motel's maintenance room. The cool air brushed against her face like the breath of the past, familiar and unsettling. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was determined. Inside, the air was colder than it had been before, not because of the weather, but because of knowing. Knowing what waited in those walls changed everything. The marble beneath her shoes felt like the skin of something ancient. The sound of her steps carried up through the empty halls, a soft echo of defiance. As she ascended the grand staircase, sunlight streamed weakly through broken windows, catching dust in beams that looked like pale ghosts hanging in the air. The silence seemed to pulse with every step she took. At the top, the penthouse door stood open, a mouth, that had already swallowed her once and wanted to again. Elena stepped inside. The room felt different now, not just decayed alive. The piano gleamed faintly under the dust. The chandelier swayed gently, though no wind moved. The portrait above the fireplace was still gone, but its absence seemed to hum. She went straight to the study. The safe was there, unchanged, waiting. The sight of it pulled at her chest, half fear, half compulsion. Inside that box sat the answer to everything, the fortune, the curse, the reason Margaret Rowe had died. She crouched in front of it, the small brass key still cold in her palm. "All right," she whispered to herself. "Let's see what you were worth dying for." The lock turned easily this time, as if it remembered her touch. The door creaked open, and the air that escaped smelled of paper, metal, and time. Stacks of bearer bonds filled the safe, hundreds of them, neatly bound with faded ribbons. Each one bore seals from banks and institutions long gone, numbers that gleamed faintly even in the low light. Elena reached for one. Her fingers brushed the paper, thick, expensive, crisp despite the years. She read the first line: United States Treasury bearer bond $500 0 payable to the bearer. Her throat tightened. She pulled another and another. They were all the same, authentic, aged, untouched. Dozens, hundreds. She did the math in her head, her mind spinning faster with every page she touched. The sum was impossible. $75 million. She sat back hard on the floor, her breath quick and shallow. The sound of her heartbeat filled the room, loud and frantic. For a long moment she just stared. The idea of it was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. With one move her entire life could change. Rent, security, a future for Matteo. No more waiting in food bank lines. No more sleeping in cars. No more begging for stability from a world that never gave it. She could take the money, disappear, start fresh somewhere far away. No one would ever know, but the thought didn't sit right. It didn't fit. She looked down at the journal beside her, the final words Margaret had written before she vanished. "They will come for it." Her stomach twisted. This wasn't just fortune. It was evidence, a relic of corruption, blood disguised as wealth. She remembered the last page, the warning: "Don't trust anyone who comes asking." Elena's mind swirled with images, Margaret writing in candlelight, her hands shaking, knowing she was being hunted. The fire that consumed her, the building left in ruin, the bonds hadn't saved her. They had destroyed her, and now, somehow, they belonged to Elena. She stood slowly, holding one of the bonds to the light. The paper glowed faintly, its edges trembling in her hand. She could almost hear Margaret's voice whispering through the quiet, a voice of guilt and pride, of desperation. The air felt heavier. A low creak echoed through the floorboards. Elena turned sharply. A shadow flickered in the reflection of the broken mirror, there 1 second, gone the next. She froze, breath caught in her throat. Then, from somewhere deeper in the penthouse, came a sound, soft, deliberate, unmistakable. A door clicking shut. Her skin went cold. "Matteo," she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. "Matteo." Panic gripped her chest. She ran into the main hall, the piano, the torn curtains, the empty space, no child, no sound. She rushed to the staircase. The hallway stretched empty below. Her breath quickened. The bonds still lay open in the safe, fluttering faintly in the draught. She turned back, and there, for the briefest second, in the window's reflection, she saw it. A man, tall, still, watching her. Her heart dropped into her stomach. She spun around, but the space was empty. The silence deepened. The shadows shifted. Then she heard it, faint but clear, the sound of small footsteps, far below. Matteo's voice, distant and scared. "Mom!" She ran. Her footsteps pounded down the marble steps, echoing through the hollow building. Her flashlight beam darted across cracked tiles and peeling walls. "Matteo, where are you?" A soft whimper answered, somewhere near the lobby. She turned the last corner and froze. The front doors were wide open, wind howling through them. Rain had started again, thin and sharp as needles. Matteo stood in the middle of the lobby, his eyes wide with confusion. Beside him on the floor was something new. A small silver lighter, polished, clean. Elena's breath hitched. She knelt, snatching him close, her voice shaking. "Where did this come from?" He pointed toward the doors. Someone dropped it, a man. Her stomach turned to ice. Outside, the street was empty. The fog thickened again, swallowing everything beyond a few feet of sight. The lighter gleamed faintly in her hand. On its side was an engraving. She read it under the weak light. M.R. Her pulse raced. Margaret's initials, again, but this one was new, clean, polished, untouched by time. She looked up at the tower, the top floors disappearing into mist. Somewhere above, she thought she saw movement, a flicker of shadow crossing the window where the penthouse slept. She clutched Matteo tight, her voice trembling. "We're leaving, now." They ran through the rain, the sound of thunder rolling behind them like footsteps that wouldn't stop. When they reached the car, Elena turned the ignition, heart hammering, and looked once more at the tower through the rain-streaked windshield. A light flickered in the penthouse window, then vanished, and for the first time she understood the fortune she'd found wasn't lost. It had been guarded, and now that it was uncovered, someone else knew too. As the rain swallowed the skyline, Elena Cruz gripped the wheel and whispered to herself, "Money like that doesn't sleep. It waits." Elena didn't remember how long she drove that night. The rain blurred the roads into rivers of light, and the windshield wipers fought to keep up. Her fingers ached from gripping the steering wheel too tightly, and Matteo's small voice from the back seat cut through the hum of the storm. "Mom, who was that man?" Her throat closed. She couldn't answer. The truth was she didn't know, but her gut told her he wasn't new to the Orion Tower. He belonged to it, like the rot and the silence, like the ghosts that still clung to its walls. She pulled into a deserted gas station, the neon lights buzzing faintly against the downpour. Rain hammered the roof as she turned off the engine and leaned her head against the steering wheel, trying to steady her breath. The lighter sat in the cup holder, gleaming faintly in the dim light. M.R. Those same initials again, but Margaret Rowe was gone, long gone. Whoever dropped that lighter had either inherited her secrets or stolen them. Elena reached for it with shaking fingers. The metal was warm, too warm, as if someone had been holding it moments before. She flicked it open, click. The flame flared briefly, then died. On the underside of the cap, a small engraving caught her eye, a date. June 5, 1993. The same year Margaret vanished. Elena's pulse quickened. She grabbed the leather journal from her bag and flipped through the pages, scanning for the same date. Near the end, her eyes found it. "He says we'll leave by the 5th, but I know what that means now. The tower burns that night. The papers must stay. He can't have them." Elena's breath caught. The lighter wasn't just a clue. It was proof. Margaret hadn't died in an accident. She'd been burned out. She closed the journal, her hands trembling, and turned toward the back seat. Matteo was already half asleep, his bear tucked under his chin, trusting the world to be kind when it never was. For his sake, she had to make this right. The next morning, the rain had thinned to a soft drizzle. The world looked deceptively calm, washed, muted, pretending to be safe. Elena parked behind a closed cafe, sipping stale coffee from a paper cup, her thoughts running faster than her pulse. If the bonds were real, and she knew they were worth more than her life had ever been. But that kind of money didn't vanish quietly. Someone had kept watch all these years, waiting for them to resurface. She could report it to the police, but what would she say? I broke into a condemned building and found $75 million in stolen bearer bonds hidden by a dead socialite. They'd call her a thief before they called her a witness. And what if the man in the tower was the one Margaret warned about, the him she feared? If he was still alive, he wouldn't stop now. Her phone buzzed suddenly, jolting her from her thoughts. The screen lit up with an unknown number. No name, just a slow, deliberate ring. Elena froze. The rain against the windshield grew louder, as if the world itself leaned in to listen. She hesitated, then answered. Hello, static. Then a voice, low, calm, male. You shouldn't have opened it. Elena's breath caught. Who is this? You found what doesn't belong to you. The voice continued. It's not safe for you, or your son. Her pulse raced. If you come near him, the voice interrupted, patient and unhurried. You're already near enough, MS Cruz. The tower remembers those who steal from it. Then click. Silence. The sound of her own heartbeat filled the car. Elena's hands shook as she tossed the phone aside, her eyes darting toward Mateo, still dozing peacefully. Every instinct screamed to run, but run where? The city wasn't big enough to hide from something that old. She started the car and pulled back into the street, her mind replaying every word. The tower remembers. By midday, she found herself parked a few blocks from the city library, an old red brick building that seemed to lean into the gray sky. If the answers wouldn't come to her, she would dig them up herself. Inside, the air smelled of paper, dust, and time, a comfort she hadn't realized she'd missed. She settled into an old wooden table with her laptop, Mateo drawing quietly beside her with crayons from the front desk. She searched Margaret Row, Orion Tower Fire 1993. For a moment nothing, then the results loaded. A headline from an archived paper appeared first. Heiress missing after tower fire, suspected financial scandal. Elena clicked. The article was brief, the kind journalists wrote before knowing how deep a story went. Socialite and real estate investor Margaret Rowe has been reported missing after a suspicious fire engulfed the penthouse of the Orion Tower late Saturday night. Authorities believe the fire originated in the study. No remains were recovered. Ongoing investigations suggest ties to financial irregularities involving missing federal bonds. The case remains unsolved. Her eyes widened. Missing bonds? The safe hadn't just held random fortune, it held the very scandal that destroyed Margaret's empire. She scrolled further. Another article appeared, dated a week later. Investigators confirm no evidence of Rowe's survival. Her business associate, Charles Denning, is wanted for questioning regarding the disappearance of several bearer bonds and the fraudulent collapse of multiple investor accounts. Charles Denning, the name hit like a fist. She dug through her bag, pulling out the old photograph, the one of Margaret, standing beside a man in a tailored suit. The face was smooth, confident, smiling. She turned it over, eyes catching the handwritten words. If they find this, burn everything. Charles Denning, he was him. And if the voice on the phone belonged to the same man, it meant he was still alive, still watching. Elena's stomach turned cold. She closed her laptop, heart pounding, and gathered Mateo's drawings into her bag. Come on, baby, we're leaving. He looked up, confused. Did we find the lady's secret? She forced a shaky smile. We found enough for now. They stepped out into the drizzle. The city seemed quieter than before, every sound muffled, every shape suspicious. Across the street, a black sedan idled near the curb, engine running, windows tinted. Elena froze. The driver didn't move, didn't look her way, just waited. Her instincts screamed. She guided Mateo toward the alley behind the library, her steps quick but steady. When they turned the corner, she risked a glance back. The sedan had pulled away, slow, deliberate. Her pulse thundered in her ears. It wasn't random, it was a message. I see you. That night, She didn't drive back to the motel. She found a shelter instead, a women's refuge tucked between two abandoned storefronts. The air smelled of bleach and coffee, but for the first time in days, she felt the faint shadow of safety. As Matteo slept curled beside her, Elena sat awake under the hum of the fluorescent light, the journal in her lap. Her reflection stared back from the window, a mother, yes, but also something more now, a witness, a survivor of another woman's unfinished story. The bonds might have been Margaret Rowe's sin, but the truth was her burden now. Elena whispered to herself, "You hid them to protect people. Maybe I can finish what you started." The words settled in the quiet like a vow. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft, rhythmic, steady. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled like the low growl of something ancient remembering her name. And as she closed her eyes, one thought burned brighter than fear. $75 million. Enough to destroy a life. Enough to change one. Enough to buy a second chance if she dared to pay the price. As dawn bled across the skyline, Elena Cruz realized that the fortune she'd uncovered wasn't freedom, it was fire. And fire always finds its way back to the hand that struck the match. By the time the sun rose again, the city had changed. Or maybe it was Elena who had. She woke to the low hum of the shelter's air vents, the faint chatter of early risers downstairs, the smell of burnt coffee drifting through the thin walls. But none of it felt real anymore. The world outside still spun in its normal rhythm, while her life had slipped somewhere between nightmare and revelation. $75 million, the missing bonds, Margaret Rowe's warning, the voice on the phone. It all clung to her like smoke. She glanced at Matteo sleeping beside her, his face soft in the grey light, innocence untouched by the storm that had found them. She brushed his hair back gently and whispered, "We're okay." But the words didn't feel true. They were armor-fragile, necessary, already cracking. By the time they left the shelter, the morning was quiet, unnervingly so. A pale sun glowed through thin clouds, turning the streets into rivers of light. Elena led Matteo by the hand, her senses sharper than they'd ever been. Every shadow felt alive, every parked car a threat. They bought breakfast from a corner stall, 2 bagels, 1 coffee. The vendor smiled, but his gaze lingered a second too long. When Elena turned away, she felt it, the unmistakable prickle of eyes following her. She looked across the street, a man in a black sedan, engine off, window cracked just enough to show the edge of a cigarette glowing faintly. His face was shadowed, but the shape of him still, deliberate, froze her breath. She pulled Matteo close, pretending to tie his shoe. "We're taking a walk, okay?" He nodded, unaware of the tension knotting her words. They turned down a side street, then another. The sedan didn't move, not at first. But as they crossed toward the next intersection, she heard it, the slow growl of an engine coming to life. She didn't look back. Not yet. Her pulse quickened, the air thickened. The city's sounds, horns, chatter, footsteps all seemed to fade into a single noise. The hum of that car behind her. "Mom," Matteo whispered. "Hold my hand tight," she said softly. She moved faster, guiding him through the narrow alleys behind the shops, weaving between dumpsters and fire escapes. The sound followed closer now, tires crunching gravel. She turned sharply, ducking into an old passageway that opened onto a crowded street. She could see people now, faces, voices, life, safety in numbers, or at least the illusion of it. When she finally risked a glance back, the car was gone. Only an empty corner and the faint smell of exhaust remained. Elena's breath trembled out in one long exhale. She knelt to meet Matteo's wide eyes. "We're okay," she whispered again. "It's just traffic, baby." He frowned, uncertain, but nodded. Children always believed their parents could protect them. She hoped that illusion would last a little longer. That night, she checked the motel parking lot 3 times before stepping inside. Every car, every shadow, every flickering light made her nerves jump. The sense of being watched wasn't paranoia anymore, it was presence. She set Matteo to bed and locked the door, then pulled out her phone. The missed call from the unknown number still sat on the screen like a bruise. She stared at it for a long time, then scrolled further down. No more calls. But there an email. Subject: you don't know what you're holding. No sender name. Just a blank address string, randomized, anonymous. Her thumb hovered, then she opened it. You've inherited a debt, not a fortune. That money was never Margaret's to hide. She stole it. You think you can keep it. You think the world won't notice. Walk away now, MS. Cruz, before you vanish like she did. Elena's heart pounded. The cursor blinked at the end of the message, waiting for her to reply. But she couldn't. Not to a ghost. She powered off the phone, staring at her reflection in the dark screen, pale. Why? Died, caught between disbelief and dread. If the message was true, then she wasn't just in danger, she was in possession of stolen history. The walls of the motel seemed to lean closer, the hum of the air conditioner turning into a soft, steady whisper. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. She froze. Footsteps followed, slow, heavy, deliberate. Elena's pulse shot through her chest. She crossed the room silently, peeked through the curtain slit. Figure moved near the vending machine, tall, wearing a hood, head turned slightly toward her door. He wasn't buying anything, he was waiting. She stepped back, hand over her mouth. The footsteps started again, closer now. Then stopped, a knock. Two slow, deliberate taps. Her stomach dropped. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Another knock. Louder this time, MS Cruz. Her blood froze, the voice was calm, familiar. The same one that had called her days ago. I think we need to talk, it said. She grabbed Matteo, who stirred awake, confused. Mom, quiet, she whispered, pulling him close. The doorknob rattled once, then again. Don't make this harder than it has to be. The voice continued, still patient, almost polite. You have something that doesn't belong to you. Let's make this simple. She backed away, heart hammering, then silence. The footsteps faded, the gravel crunching outside as the sound of an engine roared to life. When she dared to look out again, the car was gone. Only the faint glow of red taillights disappeared into the rain. Elena locked the door chain, her hands shaking. She sank to the floor, Matteo curled against her side. He whispered, "Was that the man?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, baby, that was the man." The next day, the sun came out cruelly bright, as if mocking the darkness that had taken hold of her life. Elena packed what little they had, checked out of the motel without looking anyone in the eye, and drove aimlessly for hours. Every mirror, every reflection showed her the same thing, the black sedan. Sometimes behind her, sometimes parked ahead. No matter how fast she drove, it always seemed to find her. Finally, she turned off the main road and parked in the shadow of an overpass. The engine ticked as it cooled, the world above humming with the sound of passing cars. She opened the glove box and pulled out the leather journal. For the first time, she noticed something she'd missed before: a folded slip of paper pressed between the last pages. She opened it. It wasn't writing. It was a photograph, the penthouse in flames. The fire had eaten through the walls, the chandeliers melted into glass tears, and in the corner, half burned but still visible, stood a man's silhouette holding something small and metallic. A lighter, the same one Elena now carried in her bag. Her hand shook as she flipped the photo over. A date scrawled in the corner, June 5, 1993, and beneath it, a single line in trembling ink. He said, "Fire cleans everything." Elena's breath caught. Margaret Rowe hadn't died in that fire. She'd been erased, and the man who had done it was still alive, still watching, and now he wanted her next. As dusk fell over the city, the black sedan idled at a distance, engine low, patient as a predator. And inside, A man lit a cigarette with a polished silver lighter, the flame dancing like memory in his eyes. The following days blurred together, each one feeling more like a shadow than a day. Elena no longer lived. She waited for the car to appear again, for the next call, for the inevitable sound of a knock that would come when she least expected it. She and Matteo drifted from one temporary refuge to another, a friend's couch, a shelter, a parking lot near the pier. She never stayed anywhere more than a night. The lighter never left her bag, and neither did the journal. They were her proof, her burden, her only weapons, but the watchers never stopped. At first, it was the black sedan again. Parked too long, headlights that flicked off the second she looked. Then, faces, a man at a diner counter who seemed to appear at every stop, a woman pretending to browse in a thrift shop, always within sight of Elena's reflection. The paranoia felt like a fever burning through her nerves, but deep down she knew it wasn't madness. It was memory repeating itself. Margaret Rowe had lived this before her, the isolation, the whispers, the invisible eyes. Elena had inherited more than money. She had inherited the curse. On the third night she parked near the waterfront, where old warehouses leaned toward the sea. The smell of salt and oil mixed with rust. Matteo slept in the back seat, clutching his bear. The sound of waves slapping the dock should have been peaceful, but every ripple sounded like a warning. She stared out through the windshield at the skyline, the city's pulse glowing faintly across the water. Somewhere in that glow, the Orion Tower still stood, a monument of secrets. She whispered to herself, "What did you want me to find, Margaret?" Her reflection in the glass gave no answer, only the flicker of fear behind tired eyes. Then movement, a figure, distant but unmistakable, walking along the pier toward her. The outline was tall, deliberate, carrying itself with the same patience as the man outside the motel. Elena's chest tightened. She reached for her keys, fumbling in the dark. The metallic clink was too loud. The man stopped, listening. She froze. Then, suddenly, he turned not toward her, but toward the water. He pulled something from his coat and tossed it into the waves. A faint splash echoed, swallowed by the tide. Before she could process what she'd seen, he vanished into the fog. Elena stepped out of the car, her heart racing. The night air bit at her skin, cold and wet. She ran to the edge of the pier, eyes scanning the dark water. The waves rolled lazily against the wooden posts. Something floated there, spinning slowly before bumping against the dock. A folder. She hesitated, then knelt and hooked it out with a rusted pole. The paper was soaked, but the ink still visible. Inside were photocopies, newspaper clippings, reports, letters, all about Margaret Rowe, all about the Orion Tower, and at the back, a single typewritten page, crisp, new, and out of place among the old. "You're being followed because they need confirmation. They don't know how much you found. Don't run. Find the truth. Find the woman she betrayed." Elena's stomach turned. The woman she betrayed. She flipped through the folder again, faster now. Articles, dates, property records. One stood out, a small obituary printed in the margins of an old paper. Evelyn Carter, co-founder of Rowe Holdings, deceased 1992. Cause, overdose, ruled accidental. A partner. A friend, maybe a victim. Elena's hands trembled. "You didn't just steal money, Margaret," she whispered. "You stole someone's life." The wind howled across the pier, scattering the papers. She scrambled to collect them, but one flew over the edge into the water, and for a split second, as she reached for it, she saw something move below the surface. A reflection, a face. Not hers. She stumbled back, her heart thundering. The water stilled again, showing nothing but dark ripples. When she turned toward the car, she froze. The passenger door was open. Her throat tightened. Matteo, no answer. She ran, boots splashing against puddles, hands shaking as she reached the door. Matteo was inside, half awake, frightened. "Mom," someone knocked. He whispered, "They said you dropped this." In his lap sat a small brown envelope. Elena snatched it up, tearing it open. Inside were photographs, grainy black and white but recent enough to sting. They were of her and Matteo at the gas station, the motel, the library, even the shelter. Every place they'd been in the past week. Her blood ran cold. Whoever these people were, they weren't chasing her. They were tracking her. Her fingers shook as she flipped through the photos until the last one stopped her breath entirely. It wasn't her, it was Margaret, standing beside the same man in the photograph from the study, Charles Denning. Only this time, it wasn't a posed portrait. It was candid, taken moments before the fire. Margaret was handing him something, a velvet pouch. The same pouch Elena had found in the safe. Her vision blurred. She leaned back against the car, gasping. "It's all repeating," she whispered, "every part of it." She shoved the photos back into the envelope, started the engine, and sped away from the pier. The headlights cut through fog thick as smoke. Hours later, she parked outside a small diner at the edge of town, neon lights humming in the drizzle. The place was half empty, a waitress wiping counters, an old man at the end booth nursing coffee. Elena slid into a corner seat, her nerves coiled tight. Matteo stirred beside her, exhausted. When the waitress approached, Elena ordered coffee but barely touched it. Her eyes stayed on the rain-streaked window, watching the parking lot beyond. Then, through the glass, headlights flickered. A car pulled in slow, deliberate, the same black sedan. Her pulse spiked. The doorbell jingled. A man entered, same build, same stillness. He took a seat at the counter without looking her way, but she felt his attention like a hand at her throat. The waitress poured him coffee. "Cold night, huh?" He smiled faintly. "Some things stay cold forever." The words hit Elena like static. She reached under the table, grabbing Matteo's hand. "We're leaving," she whispered. But as she slid from the booth, the man turned his head just slightly. His eyes met hers, calm, calculated. "Elena Cruz," he said softly. Her entire body went rigid. He smiled, polite, professional, a predator wearing manners like a mask. "You've found something that doesn't belong to you." Elena's voice shook. "Who are you?" He took a slow sip of coffee, eyes never leaving hers. "Someone who's been cleaning up Margaret Rose's mess for a very long time." He set the cup down carefully. "And you just made it harder." She backed away, pulling Matteo close. "Stay away from us." He chuckled, low and almost kind. "I tried that. You kept coming back." Elena's pulse roared in her ears. She turned and ran, pushing through the door into the rain. The cold air hit her like ice. She shoved Matteo into the car, started the engine, and the tires screeched as she tore out of the parking lot. In the mirror, the man stood under the diner's neon sign, cigarette glowing like a signal fire in the dark. He didn't chase, he didn't need to. He knew she'd run, and he knew where she'd go next, back to the tower, because the only place the truth could end was where it began. As the rain blurred the city lights behind her, the Orion Tower rose again in the distance, silent, waiting, and no longer empty. The watchers had stepped out of the shadows, and the game had only just begun. The road back to the Orion Tower felt longer this time, like a slow descent into the heart of a memory that didn't belong to her. Rain streaked across the windshield, thin as veins, catching the glow of passing headlights that seemed to vanish into the dark. Matteo slept in the back seat, curled beneath his blanket, his face peaceful in the faint glow of the dashboard. But Elena couldn't stop watching the road behind her. Every flicker of light, every shadow on the horizon, made her heart jolt. She should have kept driving. She should have never looked back. But the tower called to her, still quiet, patient, relentless. She whispered under her breath, almost like a confession, "Margaret, what did you do?" The name tasted strange on her tongue, intimate, heavy, dangerous. Somewhere between victim and villain, between ghost and reflection. By the time the tower came into view, dawn had begun to bleed into the gray sky. The structure loomed like a skeleton of glass and steel, rising from the mist. Time hadn't killed it, only hollowed it out. Elena parked at the curb, engine idling, eyes fixed on the broken crown of the building. The wind whistled softly through the empty streets, carrying the faint smell of rust and rain. For a moment, she sat perfectly still. Then she whispered, "Let's finish it." Inside, the silence was total. No footsteps, no echo, no city sounds. Only the faint creak of a structure that had outlived everyone who once owned it. Elena moved through the lobby with the flashlight steady in her hand. Her breath fogged the air, the beam slicing through particles of dust like falling snow. Every time she came back, the building seemed to rearrange itself as if it was breathing, remembering, reacting. The marble floors glistened under puddles from the roof leak, reflecting her shadow as she climbed the stairs. She passed the second floor where water stains spread like bruises across the walls. The third, where furniture lay frozen mid-collapse, as though someone had tried to escape and never finished. By the time she reached the penthouse, her pulse had settled into a grim rhythm. The door stood open. Just as before, but this time the air was different, stiller, heavier, touched by something unseen. She stepped inside slowly, her flashlight sweeping across the ruined grandeur. The chandelier above swayed faintly, glass shards catching the weak light like tears. The safe still sat behind the open panel, untouched, but the desk was different. Someone had been here. The papers were shifted, the dust disturbed. Elena froze. The thought of him, the man from the diner, sent a chill through her bones. She whispered into the stillness, "If you're here, you don't have to hide." Her voice echoed, long and hollow. No answer, but then she saw it, on the desk beneath the old lamp, a new object that hadn't been there before. A lighter, silver, polished, clean. She felt her chest tighten. It wasn't the one she'd found before. This one gleamed too brightly, as if freshly handled. Beside it lay a note, typed, crisp, unsigned. "Fire never forgets, MS Cruz, but sometimes it forgives." She stared at the words until her vision blurred. Her hand trembled as she picked up the lighter. It was warm, and engraved on the bottom were two letters that weren't Margaret's this time. C.D. Charles Denning, the man Margaret had warned her about, the man who'd burned her alive, the man now leaving her messages in her dead house. A shudder ran through her. Every instinct screamed to flee, but a stronger force rooted her in place. Fear, yes, but also something deeper, rage. Margaret had died in this place because of him, and if he was alive, if he'd been following Elena all this time, then he wasn't just trying to recover what was lost. He was trying to erase what was left. She gripped the lighter so tightly her knuckles went white. Behind her, the floor creaked one sharp sound in the silence. She turned, nothing. The beam of the flashlight danced across the torn curtains, the shattered glass, the piano glinting faintly in the corner. The wind moaned through the cracks, sounding almost like a sigh. She forced herself to breathe. "You can't scare me anymore." The words came out thin but steady. She walked to the window. The skyline stretched beneath her, endless, grey, indifferent. From this height, she could almost see herself years ago, the woman who'd slept in her car, the woman who'd believed the world had forgotten her. Now, the world hadn't forgotten. It had remembered too well. She turned back to the study, eyes catching on the journal resting on the desk. Its pages were curled, faintly damp, edges burned at the corners. She flipped to the end again, tracing Margaret's final entry with her fingertips. "If he lives, the truth will burn again." The fire wasn't the end. It was the beginning. A deep breath, a decision forming, Elena whispered, "Then I'll finish it." She spent the next hours searching every corner of the penthouse, driven by instinct more than logic. Beneath furniture, behind walls, under the rotted floorboards, she looked for anything that connected the story Margaret left behind. In the bedroom closet, she found a metal case blackened by smoke, half melted shut. It took her nearly half an hour to pry it open. Inside lay a stack of photographs, some destroyed by fire, others barely intact. Margaret, Charles Denning, a group of suited men standing before the Orion Tower's grand opening banner. And behind them a crowd, investors, workers, families. Elena flipped through the images and her stomach turned. Each face looked familiar not by name, but by type. People who believed they were investing in something pure. People who had lost everything when the scandal erupted. The missing fortune hadn't just destroyed a business. It had destroyed hundreds of lives, and now that fortune sat inside a rusted safe, wrapped in ribbon, untouched by consequence. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart pound like a hammer against steel. For the first time, she didn't see those bonds as money. She saw them as ashes. Thunder rumbled in the distance. A storm was building again. The air thickened, humid, electric, the same kind of air that came before something irreversible. Elena sat at the desk, journal open, lighter beside her, the safe still gleaming faintly in the shadows. Margaret had tried to make it right. She'd failed, but Elena could still choose differently. She whispered into the empty room, "You weren't the villain, were you, Margaret? You were just the last one who refused to lie." The wind answered through the broken windows, carrying the faint smell of ozone and rain. She closed the journal, the decision forming fully in her chest. She'd find the truth. She'd find the people who lost everything. She'd return what never should have been hers. But to do that, she'd have to walk through the same fire that killed the woman before her. As the first drops of rain hit the glass, Elena Cruz stood in the ruins of the penthouse not as a thief, not as a victim, but as a woman standing at the edge of a story written in flame. And somewhere beyond the storm, she knew he was watching, waiting for her to choose. Outside, lightning forked across the skyline, illuminating the tower's scarred facade, and for a brief, flickering second, a reflection in the glass smiled back a woman's face, half burned, half beautiful, as if the past itself approved of what came next. The storm arrived without mercy. By nightfall, the Orion Tower stood wrapped in rain and wind, lightning flashing against its glass skeleton like a warning from the heavens. Every sound was sharper now, the rattle of loose window panes, the groan of metal bones. Elena Cruz was still inside. She sat on the penthouse floor, surrounded by fragments of Margaret Rowe's life, burned photographs, ledgers, faded blueprints, and the safe still open like a wound. Her flashlight flickered in the dark, its beam glancing off gold lettering and glistening drops of rain creeping through the cracks. Mateo slept nearby on the couch, wrapped in a dusty throw blanket, his small chest rising and falling softly. He didn't understand what was happening. He didn't need to, not yet. Elena's fingers hovered over the stack of bearer bonds, millions in wealth that had once burned a city's conscience and buried a woman alive. The storm rumbled again, deep, distant, like an echo from the night Margaret died. Elena whispered into the darkness, "You didn't start the fire, did you?" The wind seemed to answer through the cracks in the windows, a sigh that could have been guilt or forgiveness. She pulled the leather journal closer. Pages fluttered wildly in the breeze as thunder boomed overhead. She found a section she hadn't noticed before, hidden between glued-together pages. Carefully, she tore them apart, and a folded document fell free, a copy of an official report. Rowe Holdings Financial Irregularity, Internal Aud. Its summary confidential. Her eyes scanned the text, her pulse racing. Findings indicate evidence of deliberate falsification of bond records. Transactions routed through multiple offshore accounts traced to C. Denning, recommendation, immediate investigation. Subject M. Rowe denies knowledge but refuses to produce the bonds, her breath caught. Margaret hadn't stolen the bonds Denning had. He used her company, her name, her reputation as a shield. When the investigation began to close in, he erased everything including her. Elena looked toward the window, lightning casting ghostly reflections across the room. He blamed you, she whispered. He burned it all to keep himself clean. The realization twisted inside her. Margaret hadn't been a thief or a sinner. She'd been framed, silenced, and left to rot in memory. The safe, the journal, the tower, all of it was her tomb and her testimony. And now Elena held the evidence that could expose the truth. A noise, a soft click behind her. Elena froze, the door. She turned, flashlight trembling in her grip. The door was slightly ajar, swaying gently from the draft, but she was certain she had locked it. "Matteo," she whispered, "stay down." The boy stirred, frightened. "Mom, SHH." She moved slowly, the beam of her light cutting through the dark. The hallway beyond was empty. Shadows stretched long and thin along the cracked walls. Then a second sound, a boot scraping against marble. Her breath stopped. From the gloom, a silhouette emerged, tall, confident, deliberate. A man in a black coat, the glint of metal in his hand catching the light. Elena's heart hammered. "Charles Denning," she whispered. The man smiled faintly, stepping into the room as if returning to his own home. "You've been busy, MS, Cruz." Elena's voice trembled, but her words were sharp. "You killed her." His smirk didn't falter. "She killed herself. Greed does that to people." She was protecting the evidence. Elena said, "You made her take the fall." He studied her quietly, his expression unreadable. Then, with a soft sigh, he set his lighter on the desk beside her. "You shouldn't have come back here. Some stories are better left buried." Elena backed toward the safe, shielding it with her body. "You've been watching me." "I had to," he said simply. "You were getting close. The tower's records, her journal, the bonds, it's all history that was supposed to stay dead." His voice was calm, his steps unhurried, like a man giving a lecture. "You think you're doing the right thing. You're not. You're reopening something that will destroy you. The people who lost their money, they don't care about the truth. They want blood. They'll take it from you if they can't have it from her." Elena's pulse raced, but her anger burned hotter than her fear now. "Then let them try." Denning chuckled softly. "You're brave. She was too, once." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating his face, older now, lines carved deep around his eyes, but unmistakable. The same man from the photographs, the same man who had smiled beside Margaret moments before she disappeared. Elena's hand inched toward the lighter on the table. "What did you throw into the fire that night?" His smile faded. "The truth, and now you'll do it again," she said. He shrugged. "If that's what it takes." For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy and electric. The storm outside seemed to pause, waiting. Then his voice lowered. "Give me the bonds, MS, Cruz. Walk away. No one has to get hurt." Elena looked at Matteo, still trembling on the couch, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. Her heart broke. She turned back to Denning. "You killed her for them once," she said quietly. "You'll kill me too." "I don't want to," he said, "but I will." The words hung in the air like the edge of a blade. Elena took a slow breath, her hand closing around the lighter. "You think fire erases guilt," she said softly, "but fire remembers." Before he could respond, she flicked the flame to life, its orange glow trembling between them. For a moment they both froze, the light flickering across their faces, the ghost of Margaret Rowe seeming to shimmer in the reflection of the window behind him. Then a sound, the faintest crackle. Paper burning, Denning's eyes darted to the desk. The edge of one of the bearer bonds had caught fire, the flames spreading fast across the dry, aged paper. "No," he barked, lunging forward. Elena grabbed Matteo and bolted toward the door as the flames leapt higher. Denning tried to stamp them out, but the old wood and dust caught instantly. Smoke filled the air, thick and bitter. Elena reached the stairwell, dragging Matteo close as heat rolled up the corridor. Behind her, Denning's voice echoed, furious, panicked, choked by smoke. "You'll burn with her." But Elena didn't stop. She ran, each step echoing like thunder through the tower's hollow bones. The walls groaned as if alive, the sound of fire devouring history roaring behind her. By the time she burst into the lobby, her lungs burned, her clothes streaked with soot. The rain outside hissed against the rising flames pouring from the upper floors. She stumbled onto the street, clutching Matteo against her chest. The tower behind them glowed red and gold, a beacon of destruction and rebirth. For a long time, she just stood there, watching the fire climb. It was terrifying and beautiful all at once, like the past itself was finally being cleansed. Matteo pressed his face into her shoulder. "Mom, it's burning." She nodded, tears cutting clean paths through the soot on her cheeks. "I know, baby." He looked up at her. "Is the lady gone now?" Elena stared at the flames dancing through the windows, their light flickering like the ghost of a woman finally exhaling her last secret. "She's free," she whispered, "and so are we." Behind her, sirens wailed in the distance. The rain poured harder and the fire began to fade, steam rising like a spirit leaving its body. Elena turned, holding Matteo close, walking toward the dawn breaking over the city. She didn't look back again. And as the last of the flames died, the tower stood blackened but silent, its story rewritten, its ghosts at peace. In the ashes, the truth had finally found its voice. The fire had changed everything, but it hadn't ended anything. 3 days after the Orion Tower burned, Elena Cruz was still running, not from the flames, but from the man who had lit them and the past he was trying to erase. Every headline screamed arson in abandoned luxury high-rise, but none mentioned her name. The world believed the tower had finally collapsed under its own decay. No one knew the truth, that the fire had been reignited not by accident, but by vengeance. Elena and Matteo stayed hidden in a church basement, among cots and whispers and old hymns that drifted through the stone walls. The air was cold, thick with candle smoke and quiet prayers. At night, when the others slept, she replayed the fire in her mind, the sound of Denning's voice echoing through the flames, the sight of his silhouette swallowed by smoke. She didn't know if he'd survived, but deep down she didn't believe fire could kill a man like him. He'd lived through worse and built empires out of the ashes. Now he would come for what remained her. By dawn, the city had returned to its rhythm cars, horns, life pretending not to notice its own ghosts. Elena stood outside the church, clutching her coat tighter as the wind bit at her cheeks. Matteo played with a stick in the puddles, humming softly to himself. For a fleeting moment, she almost felt peace. Then she saw the car, parked half a block away, windows tinted, engine silent. The same black sedan, again, her stomach clenched. It wasn't close enough to threaten, but not far enough to be coincidence. She took Matteo's hand. "We're leaving." He looked up. Where? Somewhere safe. But the word meant nothing anymore. There were no safe places for people who carried other people's sins. They walked quickly through the morning streets, the noise of the city swallowing the sound of their footsteps. Every reflection in every window felt like an eye. Every passing stranger could have been one of his. When she finally reached the bus terminal, she stopped to catch her breath. Buses came and went in clouds of diesel and chatter, but she couldn't focus. She scanned the crowd, her pulse thudding like war drums. And then she saw him, at the far end of the platform, leaning casually against a pillar, dark coat, silver watch, the faint glint of a scar at his temple. Charles Denning, alive. He didn't move toward her, didn't speak. Just smiled, that same thin, practiced smile he'd worn in the photographs beside Margaret Rowe. Elena froze. Every instinct screamed to run, but fear rooted her to the ground. Then, slowly, he lifted his hand, not in threat, but in greeting. A polite, calculated acknowledgement. Her mind raced. He wasn't chasing her here. He was reminding her he could find her anywhere. Elena turned, gripping Matteo's hand so tightly it made him wince. They boarded the first bus that opened its doors. She didn't even check where it was going. As the vehicle pulled away, she stared through the fogged glass. Denning was still there, watching her go, that faint smile never fading. He didn't need to follow her. He already owned the fear that would. Hours later, the bus rumbled along a coastal road, grey waves crashing against the rocks below. Matteo had fallen asleep, his head resting on her arm. Elena stared out the window, the reflection of the sea blending with the fire in her memory. She thought of Margaret again, her journal, her final words, her desperate plea for justice that never came. And then she thought of the bonds. They hadn't all burned. She'd taken some, a handful, stuffed in her coat pocket before escaping the flames. Enough to survive for a lifetime, or enough to damn herself forever. The envelope was still in her bag, heavy as guilt. She whispered to herself, "What do you want from me, Margaret?" Outside, thunder rolled again. That night, she checked into a roadside motel on the edge of a dying town. The neon sign flickered weakly, its buzz filling the empty parking lot. She paid in cash, using a name that wasn't hers. Inside, the room smelled of old air and salt. Matteo fell asleep instantly, exhaustion winning over fear. Elena sat on the bed, staring at the envelope on the table. She reached for it, her hands trembling. The paper bonds gleamed faintly in the lamplight, their embossed seals catching gold reflections. They were beautiful and terrifying. Each one was a ghost of a life stolen. She thought of the faces in those old photographs, the investors, the families, the people who had believed in Margaret's dream before it turned to ruin. She could vanish with this money. No one would ever know. She could buy a house by the ocean, send Matteo to school, erase every scar the world had given them. But another image intruded, Margaret's face in the burned photograph, half smiling, half destroyed. And Denning's voice in the fire, "You'll burn with her." Elena's hands shook. She stuffed the envelope back into her bag and whispered, "Not yet." Sometime after midnight, she woke to a sound faint, almost imperceptible. A soft click, the door latch, her blood froze. She reached for Matteo, pulling him close, holding her breath. Another sound, the creak of floorboards. Someone was inside. Her mind raced. She reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, and, her heart pounding so loud it drowned the rain outside. The silhouette appeared first, tall, broad, unmoving. "Elena," a voice said softly. Her throat tightened. It wasn't Denning. It was someone younger. A man stepped forward, hands raised to show he carried nothing. "Please, I'm not here to hurt you." The flashlight beam trembled across his face, unshaven, eyes dark, haunted. "Who are you?" she demanded. "My name's Daniel Rowe." He said quietly, "Margaret was my aunt." The words hit her like cold water. He looked at the envelope on the table. "She left them for me, but not like this. He's coming for you because you have what he couldn't destroy." Elena's pulse raced. "Denning." Daniel nodded. "He thinks the fire erased everything. It didn't. She sent copies, ledgers, names, account numbers. I've been tracking him for years, and now you've walked into the middle of it." She stared at him, unsure whether to trust or run. Why now? Because, he said, stepping closer, you found what no one else could, the proof that ties him to the scandal, to the fire, to her death. Elena swallowed hard, then helped me finish it. Daniel's gaze hardened. You sure? Once we start, there's no going back. Her answer came without hesitation. Neither of us has been able to go back for a long time. Outside, lightning flashed again, illuminating the cracked motel window, and in the glass reflection, the faint outline of a black sedan parked under the flickering sign, watching, waiting. As thunder rolled across the night sky, Elena Cruz realized the hunt had changed. She was no longer the one being chased. She was about to become the one who hunted back. The rain had not stopped all night. It drummed on the motel roof like a warning, restless and cold. Elena Cruz sat in the chair by the window, one hand resting on the worn envelope of bearer bonds, the other gripping the edge of her son's blanket. Mateo slept deeply, his breathing steady, the only sound in the small, tense room. Across from her, Daniel Rowe leaned against the wall, silent, his eyes scanning the parking lot through the curtain slit. The glow from the neon sign painted his face in flickering shades of red and blue. "Are you sure you weren't followed?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was calm, measured. "If they wanted you dead, they'd have done it already. He wants something from you first." "The bonds," she said. Daniel nodded. "And the proof." She looked down at the envelope on the table. "Then why not just take it?" "Because Denning doesn't want exposure, he wants control. He's kept his empire alive by hiding behind others. Margaret, the banks, the investors, and now you." Elena met his gaze. "I'm not like them." A faint smile crossed his lips. "That's what my aunt said." The rain hit harder against the window. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed, distant, muffled, but close enough to tighten the air in the room. Daniel's hand drifted instinctively toward the inside of his coat. Elena whispered, "You said you've been tracking him for years. Why?" "Because I owe her," he said simply. "Margaret saved me. She sent me away the night of the fire. I was 15. His eyes went distant for a moment, remembering. "She said the tower was about to burn, that he was coming. When I turned back, I saw her silhouette in the flames." Elena's throat tightened. "So he really—" "Yes," Daniel interrupted. "He killed her. She found out he used the company to move the stolen bonds. When she threatened to expose him, he made sure no one ever heard her side." Silence settled heavy between them, broken only by the sound of rain and the faint hum of passing cars. Elena leaned forward. "If what you're saying is true, we can prove it. I have the journal, I have the documents." Daniel shook his head. "Documents aren't enough. You need people who'll listen." "Then we'll make them listen," she said, her voice steady now. He studied her for a long moment, the exhaustion in her eyes, the defiance behind it. Then he nodded slowly. "All right. There's a journalist, someone who tried to reopen the case years ago. He's still in the city." Elena's heart skipped. "Then we find him." Daniel's mouth tightened. "We'll try. But if Denning's already watching you, he'll be watching him too." Lightning flashed outside, casting long shadows across the walls. For a moment, both of them froze. A figure moved past the motel window, too quick to identify, too precise to be random. Daniel moved instantly, pulling the curtain closed and motioning for silence. The seconds that followed stretched like hours. Then a knock, 3 slow taps. Elena's pulse spiked. She looked at Daniel. He mouthed, "Don't move." Another knock. Louder this time. "Elena Cruz." A voice called softly, "You have something that belongs to me, Denning." The sound of his voice sent a chill up her spine. It was calm, almost gentle, the kind of tone that made everything worse. Daniel mouthed again, "Get Mateo." She moved silently, pulling her son into her arms. He stirred but didn't speak, sensing danger in her stillness. Denning spoke again, this time closer. "You think you understand what you're holding, but you don't. Those bonds destroyed hundreds of people. You can't fix that. You can only disappear with it or burn like she did." Daniel's jaw tightened. He pulled a small pistol from his jacket and gestured toward the back door. "Go," he whispered. Elena hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll slow him down." The knock turned to a hard bang. The lock rattled under the impact. "Now," Daniel hissed. Elena grabbed her bag, clutching Matteo tight, and darted through the bathroom toward the back door. The cold rain slapped her face as she stumbled into the alley, her shoes splashing through puddles. Behind her, the motel door burst open, the sound of splintering wood cutting through the storm. "Daniel Rowe," Denning's voice echoed, low and venomous. "You should have stayed buried." A gunshot cracked through the night. Then another. Elena froze, torn between running and turning back. Matteo clung to her neck, trembling. Then silence. She whispered, "No, no," and forced herself to move. The rain drowned everything else. She ran until her lungs burned, until the neon lights of the motel were nothing but a smear in the dark. Her feet splashed through puddles, her breath ragged. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. By dawn, she found refuge in an old bus depot by the coast, long abandoned, its windows shattered and floor littered with sand. The sea roared just beyond the walls, a voice as eternal as the ghosts that chased her. She set Matteo down on a bench and tried to steady her shaking hands. The bag sat beside her, heavy, soaked, filled with bonds that now felt like chains. Her mind replayed the sound of gunfire, Daniel's face, his voice, his promise. She didn't know if he was alive. The thought of him dying for a fortune that wasn't even his made her stomach twist. Matteo tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, are we safe?" She swallowed hard. "For now. Is the bad man gone?" She hesitated. The truth sat heavy on her tongue. "No," she whispered, "not yet." The morning light crept across the floor, pale and cold. The sound of the waves filled the empty space. For the first time since the fire, Elena allowed herself to cry quietly, without breaking. She cried for Margaret Rowe, for Daniel, for every person whose life had been torn apart by the greed of one man. When the tears finally stopped, something inside her hardened. She opened her bag and pulled out the bonds. The paper shimmered faintly in the light, unburned, untouched, still whispering promises of a new life. But beneath that beauty was rot. She could feel it. Elena took a deep breath and said aloud to the empty room, "You can't have it." Her voice echoed, steady and sure. The world had taken everything from her, her home, her peace, her safety. But this time she would decide how the story ended. She looked out toward the ocean, the horizon glowing faintly gold. The sound of waves blended with the wind until it almost sounded like words, like the tower whispering one last time through the storm. "Finish it." Elena zipped the bag shut and stood. "I will." As the tide rose against the crumbling shore, Elena Cruz turned toward the city skyline and walked into the wind, no longer running from the past, but chasing the truth that had survived the fire. The ocean had no memory, but Elena Cruz did. For 2 days she stayed near the coast, hidden in a shelter run by an old woman who asked no questions. The sound of waves filled the nights, echoing against the cracked plaster walls like a heartbeat she could finally trust. The salt air clung to everything, her skin, her clothes, her thoughts, but it was the first air she'd breathed without fear since the fire. Still, peace was a stranger that wouldn't stay. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's face the way he'd turned toward the door. The sound of the gunshot swallowed by thunder. She didn't know if he was alive. Maybe she never would. She'd try to tell herself it was over. That Denning wouldn't chase her anymore. But guilt had its own voice, and it whispered every night, "You're no different from the rest if you keep what isn't yours." The envelope of bearer bonds sat at the bottom of her bag, wrapped in a damp towel. Every time she touched it, she felt as if her fingers were brushing fire. On the third morning, she walked along the shoreline as the tide receded. The sea glittered pale gold, and the gulls cried above her like lost souls. Matteo ran ahead, kicking shells and laughing, his shoes splashing in the foam. His laughter was light, the sound of a world untouched by greed. She envied that. When he found a bottle half buried in the sand, he held it up proudly. "Mom, look, a message." Elena smiled faintly, wiping sand from his cheek. "Maybe it's from a pirate." He grinned, "or from the lady in the tower." The words froze her heart. "What did you say?" Matteo shrugged. "She's in my dreams sometimes. She says thank you." Elena knelt, trying to hide the tremor in her hands. "What does she look like?" "She's pretty," he said softly, but sad, like she lost something important. Elena couldn't speak. The wind blew through her hair, carrying the faint scent of salt and memory. She whispered, "Maybe she did, baby. Maybe we both did." That night, after Matteo fell asleep, Elena sat outside the shelter with her bag in her lap. The sound of the ocean faded beneath the hum of her thoughts. She opened the envelope again. The bonds were still there, perfectly intact, worth a fortune she could never even imagine spending. But now they didn't look like wealth. They looked like confession. She unfolded one of them and stared at the signature printed at the bottom. Margaret Rowe. The name shimmered faintly in the lamplight. The ink faded but still legible. "Your name's on all of them," she murmured. "They blamed you for everything, but you were just holding proof." And suddenly she understood. The bonds weren't just money. They were evidence. A trail of deceit that could destroy what Denning had built, if someone was brave enough to expose it. She could vanish, yes. She could take Matteo far away, start over, live quietly. But every time she looked at her son's face, she saw truth, innocence, future, and that future couldn't be built on the ashes of someone else's lies. She took out her phone, fingers shaking. She scrolled through contacts, searching for a name she hadn't spoken in years, a journalist she'd met once when she still worked at the law firm. Adrian Kane. Investigative, stubborn, fearless. The kind of man who'd chased stories until they broke him. She typed, "I have information about Margaret Rowe. The Orion Tower fire wasn't an accident. I have proof." Her thumb hovered over send. She could still delete it, still choose silence. Then she pressed it. The message sent with a quiet whoosh. For the first time in weeks, she felt her shoulders loosen. Whatever happened now, she wouldn't run anymore. The reply came the next morning, from Adrian Kane's subject, Orion Tower ****, if this is real, meet me, noon, Pier 17, come alone. Elena read the message 3 times. Her heart raced, fear and relief colliding in her chest. It could be a trap. It could be Denning, or it could be the first step toward the truth. She packed lightly just her bag, the envelope, and a few clothes for Matteo. She kissed his forehead as he slept and whispered, "I'll be back before sunset. Stay here. Don't open the door for anyone." He stirred, mumbling, "Promise, I promise." The pier stretched long and empty beneath a grey sky. Waves slapped the pillars in slow rhythm, the wind sharp with the smell of salt and iron. A few seagulls perched on the railing, watching her with cold eyes. Elena clutched the envelope under her coat as she walked to the far end, scanning for movement. Then a figure. A man leaned against the railing, coat pulled tight, eyes hidden beneath the shadow of a cap. He looked older than she remembered, more tired, but still had that same restless energy she'd seen in his articles. "Adrian Kane," she called. He turned, nodded once. "You took your time. I had to be sure it was really you." He smiled faintly. "Paranoia's healthy these days, especially for people who stumble on secrets like yours." She stepped closer. "How much do you know?" "Enough to know Margaret Rowe didn't steal those bonds," he said. And enough to know Denning's been buying silence ever since. Elena's throat tightened. He tried to kill me. Kane didn't flinch. That's what he does. But if what you say is true, we can end it permanently. He extended a hand. Do you have them? Elena hesitated, glancing around. The pier was empty. Still, something in her gut twisted. Yes, she said finally, but not all, just enough to prove they exist. Good, he said, lowering his voice. Listen carefully. You can't keep them. They're federal instruments, untraceable but real. The moment we expose them, the government takes over. You'll need protection, both of you. She nodded. I don't care about the money. I just want this to stop. For the first time, his expression softened. Then let's make it stop. He gestured toward a small folder under his arm. These are the original articles I never got to publish. Names, dates, bank routes. If we combine what I have with your proof, it's enough to bury him. Elena reached for the folder, but a sound cut through the air. A car door. She turned. At the end of the pier, a black sedan idled. Her pulse spiked. Kane's eyes widened. He found you. The passenger door opened and a man stepped out. Not Denning, someone younger, rougher, dressed in grey, with cold efficiency in his movements. Kane's voice dropped. Go, now. Elena clutched the envelope. What about you? I'll stall him. Go. She ran, footsteps pounding against the wooden planks, the wind tearing through her hair. Behind her, she heard shouting, the scrape of shoes, the crash of struggle. The ocean roared louder. She turned once, Kane wrestling with the man near the rail, a flash of metal glinting in the grey light, then a gunshot. The seagulls scattered into the storming sky. Elena froze for half a second, and then she ran harder, the sound of waves and her own heartbeat blending into one desperate rhythm. She didn't stop until she reached the main road, soaked in sweat and rain, clutching the envelope against her chest like a lifeline. As the storm broke overhead, Elena Cruz realized what the price of integrity truly was: not money, not reputation, but safety itself. She could run again, or she could finish the fight Margaret Rowe had started. And this time, she swore through the pounding rain she would not burn quietly. Somewhere behind her, the black sedan disappeared into the fog. But another car engine soon started, patient and steady, following the same road, keeping its distance, waiting for her to choose whether truth was worth dying for. The rain didn't let up that night. It followed Elena Cruz all the way back to the small shelter by the sea, relentless, whispering through every crack in the roof, as if the ocean itself demanded to know what she had done. When she pushed open the door, her hair was soaked, her clothes clinging to her skin, and her hands trembled from adrenaline and grief. Mateo was waiting near the small cot. Why? Died, clutching his bear. Mom, he whispered, where were you? I heard thunder. I thought. She pulled him into her arms before he could finish. Her voice shook. I'm here. I'm right here. He hugged her tight, small fingers gripping her jacket, as if afraid she might vanish again. For a long time, neither spoke. Only the sound of the rain filled the space, steady, alive, washing away the silence that had followed her since the pier. When she finally let go, her voice was low. We can't stay here, Mateo, not anymore. He looked up at her with innocent eyes that didn't yet understand the weight of the world. Are the bad people coming again? Elena nodded faintly. Yes, but this time, they won't win. The next morning, the world outside was grey and quiet. The storm had passed, but the wind still carried the smell of salt and smoke like a warning that the past hadn't finished speaking. Elena sat at the old table by the window, staring at the bonds spread before her. The paper glimmered faintly in the weak light. They looked so harmless, just numbers and ink, but they had destroyed lives, Margaret's, Daniel's, maybe Kane's too. The journalist hadn't answered her messages since the pier. Whether he was hiding or dead, she didn't know. And yet, in her chest, the fire that had started in the Orion still burned. She reached for the journal, Margaret Rowe's final words. The edges were brittle now, its spine warped by humidity. She turned to the last page and whispered aloud, "If anyone reads this, tell them the truth doesn't die in flames. It waits." Elena closed the book slowly. "Then we'll make them hear it." She opened her laptop, one of the few things she had left that still worked, and began to type. "My name is Elena Cruz. I found what Margaret Rowe died protecting." The words flowed like blood from a reopened wound. She wrote through shaking hands, recounting everything from the letter that led her to the tower, to the safe, to the fire, to the man who wanted it all buried again. When she finished, she attached photographs of the bonds, the documents, the fragments of the old ledger, each image a confession, each file a match ready to ignite truth. And then she paused over the final field, recipient. Her cursor blinked. The silence hummed around her. Adrian Kane might be gone, but he wasn't the only one who cared about truth. She remembered the network she'd read years ago, the coalition of independent journalists who specialized in exposing corruption. She searched their names, found an address marked "Submit Tips Securely," and uploaded everything. As she pressed send, her reflection stared back from the dark screen, tired, bruised, alive. For the first time since all this began, she smiled. The next hours passed in stillness. Matteo slept again, curled up by the window. The world felt deceptively calm, but Elena knew better. Truth wasn't quiet, it echoed. By noon, her email had been opened. The reply came fast, direct, and chillingly simple. "We received your files. We're verifying now. You did the right thing. Stay hidden. Stay hidden." She exhaled shakily, but something inside her resisted. She was done hiding. She turned on the small TV in the corner, an old one left by the shelter's caretaker. Static filled the screen before a local news station flickered into view. And there it was. Anonymous source leaks evidence of decades old financial scandal. The Orion Tower bonds resurface. Elena's breath caught. The anchor's voice carried through the room. Officials confirmed that a series of photographs and financial records, believed lost in the 1993 Rowe Holdings fire, were sent to multiple news outlets overnight. Early reports suggest possible connections to the missing funds and to the company. Former CFO Charles Denning. Her hands trembled, covering her mouth. It was real, it was happening. She looked at Matteo, still sleeping. A tear slipped down her cheek, not of fear, but of release. Margaret's truth was finally breathing again. But peace doesn't last long when you expose the powerful. That night, as the world began to digest the story, Elena felt it, the shift. The stillness that comes before retaliation. Outside, headlights swept across the walls, once, twice, then stopped. Her body froze. She turned off the lamp, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Through the slit in the curtain, she saw it, the same black sedan, parked beneath the dying streetlight. Someone was inside. Waiting, her heart pounded. The old fear returned, crawling up her throat like smoke. But this time, something inside her had changed. She wasn't going to run. Not again. She grabbed her bag, the bonds still inside, and the journal. She kissed Matteo's forehead softly. "Stay here," she whispered. "No matter what happens, stay hidden until morning." He blinked, half awake. "Where are you going?" She smiled faintly. "To finish what we started." The rain began again as she stepped outside. Cold, steady, cleansing. She walked down the narrow road toward the car, her shoes splashing through shallow puddles. The headlights flickered on, blinding her in white light. The driver's door opened. Charles Denning stepped out. He looked older now, wet hair slicked back, face drawn tight with sleepless rage, but his voice was still calm, still dangerous. I have to hand it to you, he said. You did what the police never could. You brought the past back to life. Elena's voice trembled, but she didn't back away. You murdered her. You burned everything to cover your lies, and now the world knows. Denning smirked. The world forgets. It always does. Not this time. He took a step closer, the rain dripping from his coat. You could have been rich, you know. You could have walked away with enough money to never look back, but instead, he tilted his head. You threw it all away for an old ghost. Elena met his gaze. No, she said softly. I threw it away for my son, so he'd never grow up thinking silence is safer than the truth. For a long moment neither moved. The rain whispered between them. Then Denning's smile faded. You've made powerful enemies, MS Cruz. Elena nodded slowly. So did Margaret Rowe, and she's still talking. From somewhere down the road, the faint sound of sirens rose through the storm. Denning turned toward the noise, his expression hardening. You think this ends with me? You think the truth changes anything? Elena took a slow step back. It already has. Red and blue lights reflected off the wet pavement. Denning's jaw tightened. He turned toward his car, but it was too late. Police vehicles screeched to a stop, doors bursting open, flashlights cutting through the rain. Charles Denning, a voice shouted. Hands where we can see them. He froze. For a heartbeat, he looked back at Elena, that same cold, composed stare he'd worn the day he killed Margaret. Then, slowly, he raised his hands. The officers closed in, shouting commands drowned by thunder. Elena stood motionless as they took him away. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just watched as the man who had haunted 2 generations finally disappeared into the flashing lights. When it was over, she turned back toward the shelter. The rain had softened now, falling gently against her face. The weight on her chest lifted, not completely, but enough to let her breathe again. Inside, Matteo stirred as she entered. His voice was sleepy, fragile. Mom, did you stop the bad man? Elena knelt beside him, brushing wet hair from his forehead. Yeah, baby, she whispered. He's gone now. Can we go home? She smiled faintly. We're already on our way. As dawn broke over the gray horizon, Elena Cruz watched the first light spill across the sea. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained in the wind, in the waves, and in the truth finally set free. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't need to. The fire had ended. The truth had survived. The truth had finally caught fire, and this time the world was watching. In the days that followed Charles Denning's arrest, the story of the Orion Tower exploded across every screen, every headline, every whispered conversation in the city. What had begun as a forgotten tragedy now re-emerged as a scandal of historic scale. Fraud, fire, betrayal, and the billions that vanished under one man's empire. And in the middle of it all, Elena Cruz. The woman who had once slept in her car. The woman who had found a fortune in a wall. The woman who refused to keep it. Reporters swarmed like vultures. Flashbulbs burst outside police stations, courthouse steps, and even the small seaside shelter she and Matteo had called home. Every voice wanted her story, every camera wanted her tears, but Elena had already given the world what it wanted most, the truth. She didn't owe it her pain too. The government seized the bonds within 48 hours, confirming their authenticity. The investigation that Margaret Rowe had died trying to reveal was now headline news. Hidden accounts were traced, offshore transactions unearthed, and a chain of evidence, once sealed under decades of silence, was finally laid bare. For the first time, justice didn't belong to the powerful. It belonged to the broken. But for Elena, the victory came with ghosts. The city praised her. Strangers called her brave, heroic, a symbol of integrity. But none of them had seen the fire in her eyes the night she'd run through the smoke, clutching her son and a dead woman's truth. They hadn't smelled the burning dust, or heard Daniel Rowe's last gunshot echoing through the rain. The world saw triumph. Elena still saw loss. She sat alone in the courthouse hallway while the proceedings went on inside. Reporters crowded the double doors, whispering her name like a prayer. Through the glass panel, she could see Denning sitting there in his dark suit, his wrists bound, his composure unbroken. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man who believed he still owned the room. His eyes met hers through the glass, calm, almost pitying, and for a second she felt the same chill she'd felt in that motel room when he'd stood in the doorway promising her the world if she'd just keep quiet. He had once believed that money could bury truth. Now his own lies were burying him. The prosecutor's voice echoed from within the courtroom. The defendant orchestrated a deliberate financial fraud exceeding $75 million, followed by the arson that killed Margaret Rowe and destroyed evidence of the crime. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp as thunder. Denning's expression didn't break. Elena turned away. She didn't need to see him fall. She'd already watched him burn. Outside, the courthouse steps were a chaos of cameras and umbrellas. Rain began to fall again, soft, cleansing, familiar. Reporters shouted her name, thrust microphones forward. "Elena, why did you come forward? Do you regret exposing him? Was it worth risking your life?" She stopped halfway down the steps, her coat clinging to her in the drizzle. For the first time, she looked straight at the sea of flashing lenses and microphones. Her voice was steady, clear, and tired. "I didn't do this for revenge," she said. "I did it because silence is another kind of fire. It burns slower, but it destroys just as much." A hush rippled through the crowd. Even the rain seemed to pause. She continued, her voice soft but firm. "Margaret Rowe wasn't a thief. She was a woman who tried to make things right. She paid the price for the truth. I just finished what she started." And with that, she stepped down from the podium, the crowd parting around her as though something sacred had just passed through. That night, she sat by the ocean again. The city lights glowed behind her, but the sea remained dark and infinite, just as it had been the night she'd first found refuge there. Matteo slept beside her, his head resting on her lap, his tiny hand holding hers. The wind carried faint echoes of sirens from far away, but they sounded distant now, like memories finally receding. Elena looked out at the water and whispered to the wind, "It's over." But even as she said it, she knew the truth was more complicated. Justice didn't erase scars. It just gave them meaning. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out Margaret's journal, the one she'd saved from the flames. The leather was blackened at the corners, the ink faded, but the words still spoke as clearly as the day they'd been written. "If they find this, burn everything." Elena smiled faintly. "Sorry, Margaret, I couldn't." She turned another page, tracing the lines with her fingers. "I hope someday someone reads this and understands I wasn't hiding money. I was hiding proof." "I understand now," she whispered. Lightning flashed faintly on the horizon, a reminder that storms never disappear. They just move further out to sea. And for the first time, Elena didn't feel fear when she saw it. She felt peace. The next morning, she was awakened by the sound of gulls and the warmth of early sunlight breaking over the horizon. Matteo stirred beside her and blinked against the light. "Mom," he murmured, "are we rich now?" She laughed softly, brushing his hair aside. "No, baby, we're honest. That's better." He smiled sleepily. "Can we go home now?" She looked toward the distant city skyline, where the tower once stood, now reduced to rubble and memory. "Yes," she said, "we can go home." But this time, home wasn't a place. It was peace earned through pain. It was truth reclaimed from fire. As the waves rolled against the shore, Elena Cruz stood at the edge of the world she had rebuilt. The woman who once lost everything had given back what was never hers to keep, and in return, she had found something far greater than fortune. She had found herself. And as the sun rose higher, its light touching the endless sea, Elena whispered to the wind, "Thank you, Margaret. You can rest now." For days, the city burned with talk of the scandal. The headlines no longer screamed about tragedy, they told the story of justice. The footage of Charles Denning being escorted in handcuffs replayed on every major network, his once polished face now hollow, his eyes stripped of arrogance, the Orion scandal exposed, decades of deception unraveled, the fortune that should have never been hidden. But while the world celebrated, Elena Cruz moved through those same streets, unseen, the woman who had set the truth free, but refused to let fame cage her. Reporters camped outside police stations, offices, even the ruins of the Orion Tower, but she had vanished like smoke from the fire she had started, because she didn't need recognition. She just needed peace. It was late afternoon when she met with the district attorney's team one last time. The courthouse smelled of rain, soaked paper and disinfectant, the hum of air conditioning fighting against the humidity. The lead investigator placed a thick folder on the table between them. Inside were the case photos, the ledgers, the journal, the certified copies of the bearer bonds. He spoke with respect and a touch of awe. "You know, Ms. Cruz, this case, it's going to change how people look at corporate immunity. You've reopened history." Elena managed a faint smile. It wasn't about history, it was about truth. The man nodded slowly. "We'll be holding a press conference next week. If you'd like to know," she interrupted softly, "I've said what I needed to say." He studied her for a moment before closing the folder gently. "Then you've done enough." As she left the building, the late sun struck her face through the tall glass windows, warm, steady, and soft. For the first time, the light didn't hurt her eyes. She breathed it in. It didn't smell like smoke anymore. That night, Elena and Matteo boarded a train heading north along the coast. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the rails was soothing, a heartbeat of movement and distance. Matteo sat by the window, his small hand pressed against the glass as the landscape blurred by green hills, broken bridges, and the endless shimmer of the ocean. "Mom," he said suddenly, "what happens now?" She smiled gently, her reflection pale and calm beside his. "Now we start over." He thought about it, then asked, "Will the lady from the tower still visit my dreams?" Elena's breath caught for just a moment. She reached over, tucking a strand of hair behind his ear. "Maybe, but if she does, tell her thank you for helping us find our way." Matteo nodded seriously, as if accepting a secret task. The sound of the rails filled the silence between them. It was the sound of movement without fear. Elena rested her head against the seat and closed her eyes. For the first time in a long time, the darkness behind them didn't frighten her. It felt like rest earned, deserved, complete. 2 days later, the front page of every major paper bore a new headline. Roe Restitution Fund announced victims of the Orion scandal to be compensated. The bonds that once cursed the tower had been liquidated under federal supervision. The proceeds redistributed to the families who had been robbed decades ago. For many, it was a miracle. For Elena, it was closure. She sat in a quiet seaside cafe reading the paper while Matteo colored at the table beside her. The salt breeze drifted through the open door, carrying laughter from a nearby pier. The waitress, a kind woman with a tired smile, set down her coffee. "You see all this," she said, nodding toward the headline. "Can you believe people are still paying for someone else's greed?" Elena smiled faintly, folding the paper. "Sometimes paying is the only way to stop owing." The waitress gave her a puzzled look, but smiled anyway, walking off to the next table. Elena looked out toward the horizon, endless, bright, alive. She could almost hear Margaret Rose's voice again, faint but real, whispering from the place where memory and forgiveness meet. "You finished what I couldn't." That evening, as the sun sank low over the water, Elena and Matteo walked barefoot along the beach. The waves were small and calm now, the tide gentle. Matteo skipped shells across the surface, counting softly as they bounced. 3, 4, 5, he laughed, pure and unguarded. Elena watched him and smiled. That sound, his laughter, was worth more than $75 million ever could be. When he ran ahead to chase a seagull, she stopped and knelt, letting the ocean wash over her feet. She closed her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer, not to any god in particular, but to the souls who had walked this path before her. The woman who died for truth, the man who tried to protect it, and the son who gave her a reason to keep going. "I kept my promise," she said softly. "No more running, no more hiding." The wind caught her words and carried them out to sea. That night, in a small rented cottage overlooking the water, Elena tucked Matteo into bed. The sound of the waves filled the room, rhythmic and steady. "Mom," he murmured sleepily, "are we poor again?" She laughed gently, brushing his cheek. "No, baby. We're rich in the only way that matters." He smiled, eyes half closed. "Because we told the truth?" Elena's throat tightened. "Because we told the truth." He drifted to sleep, his small hand resting in hers. She sat there for a long while, watching him breathe, feeling the wind through the open window. The night air was cool, but for once it didn't bite, it healed. Outside, the moon cast a silver path across the water, a bridge of light stretching from shore to horizon. Elena stepped onto the porch and looked out, the sound of the sea whispering like an old friend. The tower was gone, the ghosts were gone, but their story, their truth would live on. She opened the final page of Margaret Rose's journal, tracing the burned edges with her fingertips. The last line was faint, but she could still read it. "If one voice survives the fire, let it speak for us all." Elena whispered into the wind, her voice barely audible above the waves. It did. She closed the book, pressed it against her heart, and let the silence fill her. As dawn touched the sea in gold and rose, Elena Cruz stood at the window of her new life, her reflection framed by light instead of shadow. She had walked through ruin and come out whole. The world knew her story, but her soul knew its meaning. The truth had not only exposed a lie, it had redeemed a legacy, and as the sun rose, Elena smiled because the fire that once destroyed everything had finally become the light that saved her. A year had passed since the night the truth caught flame. The Orion Tower no longer stood, its steel bones reduced to rubble, its stories scattered to the wind. But for Elena Cruz, the tower still lived somewhere deeper, not in glass or marble, but in memory. From her small cottage by the sea, she watched the tides roll in and out, each wave whispering like the voice of the past. The days had slowed into rhythm: dawn coffee, long walks with Matteo, quiet evenings filled with laughter instead of fear. There were no headlines now, no questions, no cameras, no eyes tracking her every move. The world had moved on, as it always did. But sometimes, in the stillness between breaths, she swore she could still hear the echoes of that building, the hum of forgotten elevators, the sigh of marble halls, the way silence once held her secrets like a hand. And in that silence she found peace. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and pine through the open window as Elena wrote, her pen moving slowly over the page of her worn journal. The title read, "The Penthouse in Memory, a True Story." It wasn't meant for fame or money, it was a promise kept. She wrote not as the woman who had survived, but as the woman who had remembered. Each word poured from her heart with the weight of all that had been lost and found. Margaret's faith, Daniel's courage, Cain's sacrifice, her own awakening. The ink seemed to shimmer faintly in the sunlight, as though truth itself had taken on a color. She paused once, staring out at the horizon where the sky touched the sea. The light there was soft, the kind of light that made you believe the world forgave itself a little each morning. Matteo's voice called from outside, "Mom, look." She turned to see him running across the sand, his hair whipped by the wind, his laughter pure and bright. In his hand he carried something small and round, a shell, smooth and gleaming. He ran up the porch steps, breathless and smiling. "It's shaped like a heart," he said, holding it up. Elena took it, brushing the sand from its surface. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "You know, the ocean makes these by breaking things over and over until they're smooth." Matteo frowned thoughtfully. "So, being broken makes things pretty," she smiled. "Sometimes it does." He grinned, clearly satisfied by that answer, then darted back down the steps to chase a seagull. Elena turned the shell over in her palm, feeling its gentle weight. It reminded her of the bond's thin paper once worth millions, now ashes scattered in an evidence vault. But this small heart-shaped fragment of ocean, it was worth more than all of them. Because it wasn't born from greed. It was born from time, pressure, and patience, just like her peace. Later that evening, as the sun began to fall into the sea, Elena brewed tea and sat by the open window. The light stretched long across the floorboards, painting the room in gold and amber. On the wall hung a single framed photograph, one she had printed from an old archive. It showed the Orion Tower in its prime, tall, proud, alive with light. She had hung it not as a monument to what had been lost, but as a reminder of what had been learned. Sometimes she spoke to it, quietly, the way one might speak to a friend long gone. "You should see it now, Margaret," she whispered. "The families you tried to help. They're rebuilding. The Roe Fund is growing every month. The world remembers you for the truth, not the scandal." The sea answered her in a sigh. She smiled faintly, taking a sip of her tea. "And don't worry, I'm keeping my promise." When night came, the cottage glowed with warm lamplight. Matteo sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching on paper tall buildings, curved staircases, shimmering windows that reached the stars. Elena leaned against the doorway, watching him quietly. "What are you building there?" He looked up with that same spark she used to see in his father's eyes. "A new tower," he said proudly, "but this one can't burn down." Her chest tightened, her eyes soft with pride. "And what's it made of?" He smiled. "Truth." For a long moment she couldn't speak. The only sound was the sea whispering outside, the same sound that had once haunted her, now gentle, steady, alive. She crossed the room, knelt beside him, and kissed his forehead. "That's the only kind worth building, Matteo." Later, after he fell asleep, Elena stepped outside onto the porch once more. The stars shimmered across the dark sky like flecks of silver glass. The waves rolled in slow and endless, carrying moonlight in their crests. She closed her eyes and breathed. For the first time in years, there was no fire behind her, only light ahead. She thought of everything the tower had given her, not in wealth, but in wisdom. It had taught her that some treasures weren't meant to be kept, that some stories had to end in order for others to begin. She whispered to the wind, "It's strange, isn't it? Sometimes what ruins us is the same thing that saves us." The wind stirred her hair gently, almost like an answer. And for a brief, fleeting moment, she thought she smelled the faint trace of old perfume, lavender, and smoke carried from nowhere. It made her smile. "Good night, Margaret," she whispered. The sea shimmered as if it smiled back. As the waves folded into the dark and the moonlight traced silver paths across the water, Elena Cruz sat quietly in the glow of her small cottage, the shell still resting in her hand. What once began with ruin had ended in grace. The tower had fallen, but its story still stood not in walls but in hearts. And as the night deepened, the woman who once lost everything finally understood. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is the peace that comes after the fire. The morning light arrived soft and forgiving, spilling across the sea like liquid glass. Elena Cruz stood barefoot on the porch, the sand cool beneath her feet, the air touched with salt and quiet. The kettle whistled behind her, but she didn't move to fetch it yet. She just watched the horizon, the same one that had once looked unreachable now close enough to touch. Her days had settled into calm simplicity. She taught English part-time at a small community school in town, where the children reminded her of how quickly hope could be rebuilt. The locals knew her only as Ms. Cruz, a gentle woman with kind eyes and a story no one asked about. That anonymity was a gift she never took for granted. The past hadn't disappeared, it had softened. The ghosts that once haunted her no longer frightened her. They guided her, quiet reminders of the people who had walked through fire so she could walk by the sea. Every so often, she still dreamed of the tower. But now it was different. The marble halls were whole again. The chandeliers shone like captured sunlight, and through the tall windows, Margaret Rowe would stand, no longer trapped in smoke or sorrow, but smiling, serene, free, fading into the glow of dawn. Elena always woke from those dreams with tears, not of fear, but of gratitude. That afternoon, the post arrived, a small envelope, no return address. She turned it over in her hands, curiosity warming her chest. Inside was a single folded letter. Dear Ms. Cruz, you don't know me, but my father once worked for Rowe Holdings. He lost everything when the company collapsed. Last month, through the restitution fund, he received a payment that changed our lives. He told me what you did, how you gave back what wasn't yours to keep. He said to tell you that people like you remind the world that not everyone forgets what's right. Thank you, L. Hartman. Elena folded the letter gently, her throat tightening. She read it again, slower this time, letting every word settle like light in water. She didn't need the world to remember her, only that some part of it was better because she had refused to turn away. That evening, as the sun melted into the ocean, she lit a single candle and placed it by the window. The soft flame danced against the glass, its glow catching the reflection of her own face, and the picture frame beside it, the old photograph of the Orion Tower in its glory days. Do you see it now, Margaret? She whispered. Your story didn't die. It became something good. The candle's flame flickered gently, as if nodding in reply. Elena sat by the window, her fingers brushing the cover of her finished manuscript. The pages were bound with twine, the title scrawled across the first page. The Penthouse in Memory, a true story of fire and redemption. It wasn't written for publishers or profit. It was written for truth, for those who had lost faith in it, and for those who had paid dearly to protect it. She planned to leave it in the town library, tucked between the biographies and memoirs, where strangers could stumble upon it the way she once stumbled upon the letter that had changed her life. The story had come full circle, from one letter to another, from a ruined tower to a quiet home by the sea. Night deepened, and Matteo came running in from outside, cheeks flushed from the wind. Mom, the stars are out. Elena smiled and followed him out onto the porch. The sky stretched infinite above them, glittering with constellations she didn't know the names of. Matteo pointed upward. That one looks like a building, he said, tracing invisible lines between the stars. She laughed softly. Then that's your tower, baby. The one that can't burn. The one that can't burn. She repeated, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. They stood in silence for a while, the surf whispering its eternal lullaby. After a moment, Matteo asked, "Do you miss it?" Elena thought for a long time before answering, "No," she said finally, "but I'll never forget it. Sometimes the things that hurt us the most become the stories that save us." He nodded thoughtfully, his small hand finding hers. "Then it was a good story." She smiled through tears, the best kind. Later, after Matteo had gone to bed, Elena sat again at her desk. The candle had burned low, its light soft and golden. She picked up her pen and added one final line to the manuscript, a closing she hadn't been able to write until now. "I thought the tower was my curse, but it became my redemption. The woman who built it lost her life to fire. The woman who found it learned to live again through truth. Some inherit money, others inherit meaning. I was given both, and I chose the one that lasts longer." She set down the pen, smiling faintly. The words didn't feel like an ending, they felt like a beginning. Outside, the waves rolled against the shore like a heartbeat that never stopped. The candle flickered once, its light trembling, and for an instant, Elena thought she saw her reflection shift in the window. Not her face alone, but another beside it. Margaret rose, smiling gently, eyes filled with quiet pride. Elena didn't move, she didn't need to. The vision wasn't there to haunt her, it was there to say goodbye. She whispered softly, "Rest easy, Margaret. The truth found its home." The reflection faded, leaving only her own, a woman reborn through ruin. When morning came, the sea was calm. The candle had burned to nothing but a small pool of wax. Elena walked down to the shore, her manuscript tucked under one arm and the heart-shaped shell in her pocket. She knelt by the water, letting the tide kiss her fingers. "Everything begins and ends with the sea," she said softly. Then, with steady hands, she released the shell into the waves, watching it float for a moment before sinking gently beneath the surface. The sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering across the water like diamonds. And as she turned to walk back toward her home, her real home, she realized that for the first time in her life, she carried nothing she needed to hide. The woman who once lived in ruins now lived in rhythm, not with the world's greed, but with its grace. The tower was gone, but the light that survived it lived on through her and her son. And as the ocean whispered its eternal promise, Elena Cruz smiled, knowing that even after everything, the story wasn't one of loss. It was one of becoming, because sometimes the truest wealth isn't what we find in safes or secrets, but in the peace that comes when we finally learn to let go. Months passed like quiet chapters, the sea marking time more faithfully than any calendar could. Elena Cruz no longer measured her days by fear or survival, but by light, morning light through her window, golden light on her son's face, candlelight against her journal at night. The world had stopped talking about the Orion Tower. The news had moved on, and the city's memory had begun to fade. But truth, Elena had learned, didn't need an audience. It only needed to be told once and remembered by the right hearts. And in that quiet forgetting, she found peace. It was spring when she was invited back to the city. A letter arrived, official, sealed with the emblem of the Roe Restitution Foundation. Inside, a short note: "Dear MS. Cruz, we will be dedicating a memorial garden on the site of the Orion Tower, honoring those who lost everything and those who gave back what was stolen. We would be honored if you and your son would attend." With gratitude, the board of the Roe Foundation. Elena read it twice, her hand trembling slightly. The idea of returning felt impossible yet inevitable. That tower had been her torment, her trial, and her transformation. To stand there again would be to close a door she'd left open in her soul. Matteo found her sitting on the porch steps, the letter open beside her. "Someone sent you mail," he said, squinting at the official seal. She smiled faintly. "It's from the people who helped fix what happened." "Are we going?" She hesitated. The ocean whispered behind them, the waves urging her forward like a patient friend. "Yes," she said softly. "We're going." The city looked different now, brighter, calmer, but to Elena Every street still hummed with old memories, the echo of footsteps in the rain, the reflection of firelight in shattered glass, the scent of smoke clinging to a past she thought she'd escaped. As their taxi neared the site, her breath caught. The Orion Tower was gone, replaced by something soft and green, a wide, open park where sunlight touched everything. Young trees swayed in the wind, their leaves whispering in chorus, and in the center stood a small marble monument engraved with words simple but eternal: "Truth endures." Elena stepped out slowly, Matteo's hand in hers. The city air smelled cleaner than she remembered: damp soil, grass, and the faintest trace of sea salt carried by the wind. Dozens of people had gathered: families, survivors, reporters, city officials. Some faces she recognized from old photographs, the sons and daughters of those who had lost everything when the Orion burned the first time. When they saw her, murmurs rippled through the crowd, but there was no frenzy, no cameras flashing. Just quiet gratitude. She didn't give a speech. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was the closing line of the story. As the ceremony ended, the chairman of the foundation approached her, a kind man with silver hair and eyes that carried years of understanding. He extended his hand. "Ms. Cruz, I can't thank you enough. Because of you, hundreds of families have found restitution. You gave back what the world forgot." Elena smiled gently. "I just passed on what didn't belong to me." He nodded. "That's what makes it powerful." He handed her a small envelope. "There's something we wanted you to have, a token of remembrance." Inside was a photograph, restored, colorized, alive. It showed Margaret Rowe in front of the Orion Tower on its opening day, sunlight catching her hair, pride in her eyes. On the back, a single line was written in delicate handwriting: "For the one who finished what I began." Elena's chest tightened. She turned the photograph over again, tears glinting in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. She and Matteo wandered the memorial garden for hours after the crowd dispersed. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, scattering light across the marble paths. Small plaques lined the walkway, each one engraved with a name: the victims, the workers, the forgotten investors who had once trusted in a dream built on lies. Near the end of the path, Matteo pointed to one plaque set apart from the rest. "Mom, look." The inscription was simple: "Margaret Rowe, visionary, truth teller, never forgotten." Elena knelt, brushing her fingers across the carved letters. "She's home now," she murmured. Matteo tilted his head. "Do you think she knows?" Elena smiled softly. "Yes, baby, she knows." They stood there until the sun dipped low, until the marble began to glow gold in the evening light. For the first time, Elena didn't feel haunted by the past. She felt held by it. That evening, before leaving the city, she stopped one last time at the edge of the construction site where the Orion once stood. She stood in silence as the wind moved through the garden, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves, the sound of a world healing. She whispered to the air, "You're free now." And though she didn't expect an answer, she felt something: a presence, a warmth that brushed her cheek like the breath of someone saying thank you. The train ride home was quiet. Matteo fell asleep against her arm, his small hand clutching the restored photo of Margaret Rowe. The rhythmic sound of the tracks beneath them lulled Elena into thought. She watched the city fade behind them, its lights blending into the horizon. What once represented pain now shimmered like forgiveness. She opened her journal, writing only one line: "Some stories end in silence, but the truth always echoes in light." She closed the book and leaned her head against the window, watching the reflection of her face against the night, a face no longer shaped by loss, but by strength. The city's glow faded completely, replaced by the vast darkness of the coastline. And in that darkness, she saw it again, faint, distant, but real, the outline of a tower made of stars, standing tall in the reflection of the sea. It wasn't the Orion. It was something eternal. It was memory rebuilt not in stone, but in spirit. As the train carried her back toward the shore, Elena Cruz realized that not every ending was a closing. Some endings were beginnings disguised as calm. The world had taken her through fire and silence, loss and truth, and in return, it had given her one final gift, peace that no storm could steal. The penthouse was gone, the fortune long surrendered, but the light remained proof that even in ruin, redemption can bloom. And as the horizon welcomed dawn, the woman who had once lived among ashes smiled, knowing her story had finally come home. The morning after returning from the city, Elena woke to the sound of the sea. It was calmer than usual, not the restless rhythm of waves she had always known, but something slower, softer, as though the ocean itself was at peace. She stood by the window of her cottage, the sunlight painting the floorboards in honey gold. Mateo was still asleep, his face pressed into his pillow, a faint smile playing on his lips. For a moment she just watched him, her heart swelling with the kind of quiet love that makes all suffering worth it. Then her eyes drifted to the small table near the window where the photograph of Margaret Rowe now rested beside the shell Mateo had once found. The two sat together like old friends, one born from the sea, one reborn through fire. And in that gentle morning light, Elena realized something profound. The tower was never meant to stand forever. It had been built to rise, to fall, and to leave behind a story that taught others how to rebuild not in marble or gold, but in truth. That was its real legacy, and she was part of it. The months that followed were unhurried and full of small, golden moments. Elena wrote letters for the families of those who had been helped by the restitution fund. Some she knew, most she didn't. She simply wanted them to know that their suffering had not been forgotten. She wrote to the board of the foundation too, enclosing a short note. The tower's ashes gave birth to something better. Thank you for letting it live on through kindness, not wealth. Each time she mailed a letter, she felt lighter, as though she was sending away the last fragments of the burden she once carried. By summer, the garden outside her cottage was in full bloom. Wildflowers grew along the fence, and bees hummed lazily in the sun. Mateo had built a small wooden tower out of driftwood near the porch, his memory castle, he called it. He was painting it when she came outside, his face streaked with blue and gold. "Careful," she said with a laugh. "You've got more paint on you than on the tower." He grinned, unbothered. "It's okay, Mom. Art's supposed to be messy." She smiled, kneeling beside him. "You're right. So is life." He looked at her seriously then, tilting his head. "Do you think we'll ever go back to the city again?" Elena thought for a moment, watching the waves curl gently in the distance. "Maybe someday, but for now, I think the city has enough of us." Mateo laughed, dipping his brush into another jar of color. "Then we'll build our own tower here, one the wind can't knock down." Elena touched his cheek. "You already have." That evening, the sun set in a blaze of crimson and gold, the kind of sunset that looks like the world is on fire, but beautifully so. Elena sat on the porch, the scent of salt and jasmine heavy in the air. She opened her journal for the last time. The pages were nearly full, words upon words, that traced her journey from ruin to redemption. Every tear, every choice, every whisper of courage lived here now, bound not in wealth but in memory. She turned to the final blank page and began to write. "Once I believed that life only gave second chances to the lucky. But now I know second chances are born from truth. You earn them by standing in the fire and walking out with your soul intact. The tower fell, the fortune burned, but the truth survived, and so did I. If this story ever reaches another soul lost in their own ruin, I hope they remember this. The light never leaves. It only waits for you to open the door again." She set the pen down and exhaled slowly. The wind rustled through the curtains, flipping the pages like the sea turning tides. Elena smiled. "That's enough," she whispered. Later that night, after Matteo had gone to bed, she took the finished journal and placed it inside a small wooden box, along with the photograph of Margaret Rowe, and the last remaining scrap of a bearer bond, the one she had kept all this time, not as wealth, but as proof of the story that changed her. She carried the box down to the water's edge. The moon hung full above the ocean, its reflection stretching across the waves like a silver path. She knelt in the wet sand, the box in her lap. "This was never mine," she said softly. "It belonged to the world, to you, Margaret, to Daniel, to everyone who lost and learned." She placed the box gently into the surf. The tide caught it slowly, lifting it, cradling it, and carrying it out toward the horizon. The moonlight shimmered on the lid as it drifted away until it became a dark speck swallowed by silver. Elena stood there long after it was gone, the water washing over her feet, cool and clean. The sea had taken it, just as it had once taken her fear. Now both were at rest. When she turned back toward the cottage, the windows glowed softly with lamplight. Matteo's shadow moved across the curtain, a small, dancing silhouette full of life. She smiled to herself. He was the proof that love could survive anything: fire, loss, even truth itself, because love was truth, and it was endless. In the days that followed, Elena began to write again, not about the past this time, but about beginnings. Her new manuscript wasn't about towers or fortunes, but about light, the light we carry, the kind that doesn't fade even when everything else does. She called it Inheritance of the Sea. It wasn't about Margaret or even herself. It was about everyone who had ever stood in the ruins of something they loved and chosen to rebuild anyway. One evening, while walking along the shore with Matteo, they found a small glass bottle washed up on the sand. Inside was a single slip of paper, faded but legible. Matteo pried it open carefully and read it aloud. "To whoever finds this, remember, the ocean never keeps what it doesn't love. If it returns something to you, it's because you were meant to carry it forward." Elena felt a chill, gentle but deep, as if the sea itself had written it for her. She smiled, brushing her hand through her son's hair. "See, baby," she said softly, "even the ocean remembers." He grinned, running ahead down the beach. Elena stayed there a while longer, the bottle warm in her hands, the tide wrapping around her ankles. Above her, the stars shimmered, not cold and distant this time, but alive, like the reflection of the city lights that once burned inside the Orion Tower. And as she looked up, she whispered to the night, "I'm not afraid of fire anymore." The wind carried her words out to sea, where they would join all the others, Margaret's, Daniel's, her own. Stories lost, found, and reborn. As dawn painted the horizon, the first rays of light broke through the clouds, spilling over the waves like liquid gold. Elena Cruz stood by the water's edge, her heart steady, her eyes bright. The sea had taken everything once and given her back something far greater. It had given her peace, it had given her truth, it had given her the legacy of light. And as the wind rose and the day began, the woman who had once been broken by the world finally understood she had never been poor, only waiting to discover the kind of wealth no one could steal. The kind that lives forever in the story you leave behind,